All right, guys, welcome to the stream today. We're going to take a break from the Deconstructing the Church series. I know we just started it. We're a few episodes in. That is going to come back next week. We got a lot more to talk about, and I'm excited about that series. But we're going to take a break on the stream today because there's been so much news that has come out in the church world in the last couple of weeks that I felt like we needed to address it, and not just address random church news stories. We're not just talking about one scandal or one concern or one story or another. I want to talk about a pattern. And I want to ask some really tough questions about that pattern because, y'all, there is a pattern of sin in the church. And I think there's only so long that we can say we're surprised by this stuff, that we're shocked by this stuff. At some point, I think we got to look in the mirror and we've got to say, hey, why don't we see these things coming? And why don't we see these things coming in enough time to stop them, to protect people, to protect the truth? How can we not better protect the sheep after we've seen scandal after scandal after scandal? After we've seen painful experience, traumatic experience after traumatic experience? How are we not learning? How can we not protect people better? Not as institutions, not as church leaders, but as the church, as the body of Christ. And today we're going to talk about a bunch of different stories, multiple different things, but that one thread that is going to kind of run throughout this whole thing is that sin leaves us clues, y'all. Sin leaves us clues. And there is a reason why at SAI we are so hard on certain practices, why we push on things like NDAs, why we push on things like transparent governance. Because when we looked at 100 churches last year, and if you haven't checked out our Building Safer Churches report, it's on the Spiritual Abuse Institute website, spiritualabuse.institute. Check resources, research. You'll find it there. But last year, we looked early in the year at 100 churches that had faced scandal in the last 5 or so years. And there are a lot of kind of red flags that those churches had in common, and churches that hadn't had any scandals. Ministries and churches that are considered safe generally, they had a lot of green flags on the opposite side of that in common. So we're hard on things at SAI that sometimes people are like, Jeff, you're just too hard on those things, right? I've got an article that's going to be coming out soon where we actually got a response from one of the massive churches that we published about them being known to use NDAs, them being reported to use NDAs. They gave us a response, and I think they thought the response would fix it. I think they thought their comment was awesome and it was going to remove all concerns people would have about it. Well, I'm going to get to share that with you all, hopefully, in the coming week. And actually, their response only raised more questions. Now, people from that church, for instance, when that article comes out, they're going to say, Jeff, you guys are just too hard on churches. Like, come on, don't you think you make too big of a deal out of things like NDAs? And when we talk about the stories we're going to talk about today, and we talk about this theme that we're going to talk about on the stream, I think you're going to see the reason why and the answer to why I'll always say, no, I don't think we're being too hard on anyone, because sin leaves clues. And if we will pay attention to the behavior of the wolves in our midst that end up hurting people, that end up traumatizing people, that end up devouring the sheep, if we'll pay attention to that, we will more easily recognize it, and we will recognize it earlier the next time it happens. And what if we could recognize wolf-like behavior before we gave these wolves leadership and authority in the sheep pen? What if we recognize there's problematic behavior here that has to be dealt with before we invited them into the sheep pen? So that's going to be kind of the theme, what we're going to talk about today. And guys, again, these stories they may feel like they're going to be all over the place in different ways, but I think you're going to see this theme. So we're going to record all of this. This is probably going to be put on the podcast. I don't know if it's all going to be one episode together. We're going to, probably put these out separately next week as well. But all of these will come out as standalone videos. So if you're not familiar with our live streams, we take it slower on the live streams. We do these unscripted, unedited. We just kind of share everything live, and we have a conversation as we go. So in between segments and stories today, we're going to have that conversation. If you have questions, go ahead and drop them in the chat. You have thoughts, you have concerns, you have things you're seeing that I'm not seeing. You have things you want to talk about more. Regardless of what that is, your voice matters, and these streams are better when your voice is in it. So drop those in the chat today. But if you're here and you say, Jeff, I just want to hear these stories, all of them are going to be released probably standalone, but at least as a standalone video on the podcast. And when we release those, they are edited. They're much more quick to the point. They don't have the community engagement in them. So if you just want that information, if you look at our thumbnails, that's the best way to tell, because these light colored thumbnails that look like this, that's every live stream. We use the same kind of looking thumbnail so that you see it's a live stream, and we put it in the description. This is a live stream. And when you see the kind of the green, the blue, the purple, the other style of thumbnail with those backgrounds, that's going to be those standalone videos. But if you are here for the stream today, join this conversation. But I want to warn you before we get into this, okay? Some of the stuff is going to be triggering. Some of the stuff is going to be heavy. Okay, so man, if you find something that triggers you, feel free to just check off for that story and then come back and hear the other ones later. Okay. There's going to be some stuff that we talk about where I'm going to allude to some very triggering, traumatic things. We're not going to talk about them in depth on the stream today, because I think that is too heavy for a lot of people. There's a lot of stuff that we don't have to necessarily talk about, but I will point you to where you can get that information. So I don't want you to think that I'm hiding anything from you. But I really just want to look at these different stories, and I want to begin to ask the question, should we be surprised when we keep seeing sin like this, scandal like this in the church? And how can we keep from being surprised by it in the future? So again, I'll stop multiple times throughout the stream, and engage with anything in the chat. So let me know anything that you're thinking, because I would love to hear from you all today. But let me go ahead, pull up a couple of notes here, grab a drink of water, and we'll go ahead and jump into this stuff today. Also, let me know as we're going today. Always feel free to let me know if there's topics you want me to cover in the future. We are in the middle of this Deconstructing the Church series, but we're trying to make space in these streams so that more often than not, there's still a couple of other segments where we're talking about different topics, different news stories. So if anything ever comes up and you say, Jeff, I would really love for you to talk about that, you can let me know in the live stream. But you can also, you can also send us if you send us an email, you probably noticed an autoresponder lately that lets you know there's a brand new mailbag. I'm going to be giving you much more information about that in the future. I actually don't have it all in front of me today, but we're putting together a whole kind of email system, as well as a place where you can leave us recorded messages where you can ask questions and stuff like that. So if you ever want us to talk about something on the podcast, maybe you don't want to put your name or your username behind it, we're going to have that available soon too. But for today, if there's something you want me to cover next week, go ahead and let me know. But with that, let's go ahead and let's jump into today's stream and the multiple stories that we're talking about. Sin is absolutely rampant in the church right now, but is it possible that we're getting exactly what we've chosen? Is it possible we're getting exactly the things that we are choosing by our actions? I know you're going to be saying, Jeff, of course not. We don't choose sin. We don't want this trauma. We don't want spiritual abuse. And I know that we don't consciously choose it in most cases, but could it be that behind all of the surface things, when we look deeply and we look deep into the mirror, could it be that our actions are actually unintentionally choosing some of the harm that the church keeps experiencing and that the church keeps doing to itself, that we keep doing to one another in the body? And so often, guys, we act surprised. We act shocked by every scandal, by every new revelation, especially some of the more heinous and wild stuff that is going on. But should we be surprised when someone who acts like a wolf eventually gets in the sheep pen and eats some of the sheep? Should we be surprised when a person who acts like a wolf begins to devour the sheep? And the scandals, the sin, everything that we're seeing going on in the church, the pain, it is heartbreaking and it should break our hearts. But I don't think it should be surprising. Okay. And part of the reason for that, have you ever heard this phrase? Okay. This is something that I heard a lot in like coaching and consulting circles. Have you ever heard the phrase success leaves clues? Well, just like that phrase, success leaves clues. And what that means is, hey, if you want to find out how to be successful, watch successful people, because success leaves clues behind. It leaves breadcrumbs behind. And if you follow those clues and you follow those breadcrumbs of successful people, successful companies, successful ventures, then you can learn a lot about what it means to be successful yourself. Just like success leaves clues, I believe that sin leaves clues. And if we will pay attention when we see a scandal and not just be heartbroken over it, absolutely be heartbroken over it, but if we will also begin to study it, begin to ask questions, begin to look in the mirror, I think we're going to see that sin leaves clues. And when we find those breadcrumbs and we pick them up and we begin to look at them, I think what we're going to realize is that when we enter into a new church situation or we see another situation and it seems like something is off in your spirit, you'll be able to pick up those breadcrumbs and go, well, maybe what's off in my spirit is I remember seeing something like this before. And I remember that it eventually ended in scandal. It ended in trauma. It ended in people having PTSD for the rest of their lives because sin leaves clues. I've seen this before. And I'm not saying this person is going to sin. I'm not saying this church is going to experience scandal or this pastor is going to fall. But what I can say confidently is I've seen this breadcrumb before. And if we don't deal with this, there's a high likelihood that this kind of behavior, this kind of system, these kind of choices, fill in the blank, could lead to deep sin, deep damage, deep scandal. So if we'll pay attention to the clues that sin leaves, I think we can start avoiding some of the most damaging things that are happening in the church today. And every time that we choose to hide sin, to protect a leader, to protect their reputation, to protect the church, or every time that we choose to restore a leader because they're entertaining or because they're talented or because they bring in money to the bottom line. I believe every time we do those things, we are maybe unintentionally choosing sin. And we're not only choosing sin, we're choosing its consequences. And guys, the Bible is very clear on the consequences of sin. The consequences of sin, it's going to breed pain, it's going to breed regret, it's going to breed death. And that's a lot of what we're experiencing in the Western church today. But the good news is, if we want it to stop, we've just got to start choosing a better path. So, what we're going to do today, we are going to start looking at some stories, some things that have gone on, some things that are in the news lately that are heartbreaking. Some things that are in the news lately, some aren't as heartbreaking as they just are concerning. Okay. They raise questions, they raise concern. But we're going to look at these different things and the thread that is going to hold them together in this conversation. The thread that's going to hold them together is that sin leaves clues, and we are going to see clues that when you reverse engineer this, when you look at it on this end, we should be able to say, hey, uh, these things keep happening. We keep seeing a lot of these same things. They keep leading to sin. And then we're going to look at some of these and we're going to say, okay, well, now we're doing the same thing again. Is it possible that if we pivot and we acted differently, or we demanded accountability, or we were a little harder on some of these things, or had some more uncomfortable conversations, is it possible that we could kind of stop this train wreck from happening right in front of us in the future? And I want to start by talking about a story that I haven't wanted to talk about. I haven't addressed it. There's been a lot of things rumbling around out there for a while. There's been some news stories. I haven't addressed it because I didn't have enough information. But a recent story that the Roy's Report put out actually included litigation information. Okay, we're talking about 200 plus pages of court documents. And I spent my morning pouring through court documents that were, guys, they were not only heartbreaking, I mean, they were devastating. They were things that, again, I'm not going to share a lot of it with you. You can go read those court documents if you would like. But I'm going to share some of the highlights with you. But I want to talk about Greg Laurie. I'm going to talk about Harvest Bible Church. Now, if you're not familiar with Greg Laurie, he is a very well-known kind of charismatic pastor in the Harvest Bible Chapel movement. Okay. He's very well known. You're going to hear him on the radio if you're listening to things like K-Love and stuff like that. Over the years, you'd hear little, snippets where he'd give you like, a minute with the word or this, that, or the other. He's on a lot of podcasts. He does tours. He does events. And by and large, Greg Laurie has had a really good reputation. I don't know a lot about Greg, and I didn't know a lot about this situation. So a little while ago, a few months ago, there began to be some talk of, some rumblings of, did Greg Laurie, did Harvest Bible Chapel, did they actually cover up for a child abuser? Did they cover up for one of their missionaries years ago who was overseas and was essaying kids, right? That's the thing that is out there. Did they know about it? Was it happening? And did they cover it up? Now, when this first started coming out, of course, people get upset. Christians get upset. And I get it, because a lot of Christians love Greg Laurie. Okay. They respect Greg Laurie. They've listened to his podcast. They've listened to his sermons. And because of that, our immediate response as Christians, anytime, and guys, this isn't for everybody, but this is for most of us. Anytime someone that we know, that we love, that we respect, that we've listened to, that we have this idea of who they are, when we hear about bad things happening or we hear about potential sin, our first response is to push back and go, no, that can't happen because they made a difference in my life. That can't happen because I've listened to their sermons and their sermons move me. That can't happen because I go to their church. That can't happen because I listen to their podcast. And why do we immediately jump to that response? Well, it's cognitive dissonance. We talked about it before, but there's something in our brains that guys, we experience pain when someone who we have listened to, someone who we have allowed in our lives, someone who maybe has had a positive impact in our lives, when they do something wild, something super out of pocket, something sinful, something criminal, any of those sort of things, makes us feel like we can't even trust ourselves because we say, well, no, I can trust my experience. Surely I didn't get duped by a person who actually impacted me spiritually, or a person who helped me get closer to God, or a person who God used them in my life at this certain time. Surely that couldn't happen and God couldn't use them if they're in the middle of this sin. And then we say, surely I would have known, right? So we fight to protect these people. Okay. And I saw a lot of that happening when this story about Greg Laurie first came out. Again, I didn't know much about it. So I just kind of sat on the sidelines. I haven't talked about it a whole lot, but I've seen a lot of Christians coming to his aid and people, attacking Julie Roys and others for even talking about this. She had a pretty good conversation with Mike Winger when she sat down with him a couple of weeks ago, where she mentioned some of this. And Mike did a good job of saying, hey, the stuff that I've read, I didn't see a ton of damning evidence there. It really seems like there's still a lot of questions, but I'm not the expert in this, so I'm waiting for more to come out. But recently, Julie has shared an article, and let me go ahead and share my screen with you here. But Julie shared an article. It was actually Daniel Silliman on julieroys.com. So it's the Roys Report, but not Julie. But the title's Lawsuit: Greg Laurie's Church Covered Up SA Misconduct of Top Pastors, paying $4 million to sign an NDA. Now, when I saw that headline, it piqued my interest. And y'all know why it piqued my interest. It piqued my interest because anytime there is talk of NDAs, I'm hyper vigilant. All my red flags go up. My spidey senses are going crazy because here's what I know. Just because there's an NDA involved in a church, just because a church is using an NDA, that does not mean there's scandal. It does not mean there's sin. But the likelihood of scandal taking root, the likelihood of devastating sin taking root and growing into something heinous, it is so much more likely where there are NDAs, because it's not just the NDAs, it's the concessions that we make, right? It's the moral concessions we make to talk ourselves into why NDAs are a good idea. I believe it's just a slippery slope, and more often than not, it is going to lead us down other slippery slopes. And eventually, we're going to entertain other sin that we wouldn't entertain, just like we wouldn't have originally maybe entertained NDAs. Okay. So I saw this article. I saw it was about NDAs, and not only NDAs, but I saw a $4 million like payment of consideration in this NDA. And I was like, okay, that's a big one. I have seen NDAs with payments all over the spectrum, from a few $1,000s to I've seen many that are six figures, that are pretty large payments. I've never seen one in ministry or in church that was over $1 million, let alone $4 million. But not only that, what piqued my interest was I saw that this was a lawsuit. Okay. And you see, this came just a few days ago. This was March 9th. Okay. You see the picture of Greg Laurie there, a couple of other leaders from Harvest Bible Chapel. You can go back, you can read this article on your own. There is a whole lot there, but this lawsuit is linked, and this is what I want to talk about, because this lawsuit, and again, fair warning, trigger warning, it talks about some very, very heavy, very just gross child SA type stuff. Okay. I'm going to do my best to not read those things, to not show you those things on the screen. At one point, you're going to notice I'm just kind of going through tons of pages, and it's because I don't want to stop on those. There are 22 different plaintiffs in this case, 22 different people who have signed on, who said, when I was at one of these orphanages, one of these foster homes, okay, when I was here with this missionary from Harvest Bible Chapel, okay, when I was there, I was SA'd, I went through traumatic experiences, and they detail their experiences in this. So again, I'm not hiding anything from you. If you want to go check that out, you can, but I don't want to get into the weeds on that. And I don't want to trigger someone. I don't want to traumatize someone where we don't need to. But again, sin leaves clues. And when we look back at it, I got to be careful here. Just because this is in a lawsuit does not mean it is true yet. Okay. This lawsuit's over 200 pages. These attorneys are asking for a jury trial. They believe that they're telling the truth. They believe they've got a case here, and they're going to talk about a lot of different evidence, a lot of different testimony, all that sort of stuff. But this thing is probably going to go to discovery. It's probably going to go to a jury trial. Some of this stuff is might be found out as, hey, these are allegations that aren't true. Okay. So I'm not saying that every allegation here is true. We don't know that and we won't know that. But the amount of red flag things that are brought up here, okay, it just reminds us that sin leaves clues. And I want you to think about this as we walk through this story. How many times do we ignore red flags because they get explained away? We ignore red flags because it's comfortable. How many times did people potentially ignore red flags here? Okay. Again, I don't know if Greg Laurie is guilty of any of this. I don't know if Harvest Bible Chapel is, but what I can tell you is there is a whole lot of smoke here to not be any fire. It is going to be exceedingly difficult with this amount of accusations, this amount of people, this amount of witnesses. It's going to be exceedingly difficult for Pastor Laurie to ever be above reproach biblically. It's not impossible, but he's got to answer these reproaches. But as we're going through, you're going to see a lot of different things that it just makes me wonder, what if people had stopped and asked questions about more benign systems, more benign behaviors, maybe things that's easy to brush off and say, well, it's not that big of a deal. I mean, I don't want to cause division in the body of Christ. I want to bring unity. So I'm just not going to deal with that right now. That's the easy choice. But what would have happened if more people had made the uncomfortable choice and said, you know what? I have concerns. Let's talk about this as they went along. Because what happens? Sin doesn't just leave clues. What happens when sin is not dealt with early? Well, the Bible says that sin grows. And what happens when it's fully grown? It gives birth to death. And I think you're going to see a lot of pain, a lot of struggle, and a lot of death here. And I'm not talking about physical death, but I'm talking about that man, death of dreams, death of emotions. There's just a lot of pain that has come from various people's sin here, right? And again, I don't know what's true. I don't know what is not. I have to say that, we're just looking through these court documents. But again, at some point, we've also got to be really honest with ourselves and say it's not likely, in my opinion, and this is just my personal opinion, it's not likely that in this 200 pages of allegations, these 22 plaintiffs, the multiple witnesses that are referenced, the multiple things that are referenced, it seems very unlikely to me that none of this would be true. So now the question is, what is true? What does the court find? And then what does the church do from there? But it's also important to note that while this is going on, and it looks like this is about to go to court, if this goes to court, I don't know what Harvest Bible Chapel is going to do, but as far as I know, Greg Laurie is not on leave or anything else. He is still doing ministry like normal. And that feels like it would be much harder to do if this goes to this kind of trial. But again, we make choices that are comfortable. And for a lot of people, it's, well, you're innocent until proven guilty, which is an American ideal, and it's a good ideal. It's also not a biblical ideal with church elders, because the biblical ideal is you're above reproach. And if you're not above reproach, you need to answer the reproach to become above reproach. But too often, we're willing to overlook potential big red flags like this because we don't want to put somebody on leave the wrong way, instead of saying, hey, why don't we put you on leave while we pursue truth? We're not accusing you. We're not saying that you're guilty of all these things, but there's a high likelihood that something's probably going on here. Let's put you on leave to make sure that people are protected, including the person who has accusations against them. But I haven't heard of anything like that. Now, if you haven't read many court documents, okay, this stuff is dry. There's a lot to it. I'm just going to try to take you through some things that I have marked, and I want us just to look for those clues of sin. I want us to look, and I want us to ask the question, would people have known about this, and should people have known about these things? What if people had asked questions all the way through this process? So let's go ahead and let's look at this. This is a lawsuit that was filed. Apparently, this was multiple lawsuits, maybe 22 separate lawsuits. This is a motion essentially to consolidate all of these lawsuits into one suit with 22 plaintiffs in California. And it's from McAllister Oliverius. This is the law firm that is handling this, and you actually can see all the information there, okay? Filed in the United States District Court, Central District of California. You see all of that stuff there. Look at this, just looking at the table of contents. The last thing that you're going to see, line 18 right there, is past page 200, okay? Hundreds of pages of documents mainly detailing allegations and why they believe this case would succeed if it went to trial, and they demand a jury trial here. Okay. Now, they give all the names. I'm not going to go through a ton of the names of the plaintiffs and stuff like that. Again, you can go through and you can see this. There's a lot here, but I just want to go through some of the highlights. And you see right here, this highlighted. Laurie even authorized a gift to Havsgard. Now, Havsgard is the missionary who is alleged to have abused these children. He's the missionary that is alleged to have, essayed 22 of these plaintiffs. The allegations are that leaders at Harvest Bible Chapel, including Greg Laurie, should have known, did know, didn't do anything about it. The allegations, of course, as you're going to see, is that they covered it up. So there's all kinds of allegations here, but it says Laurie even authorized a gift to Havsgard from Harvest Riverside Funds in California of some $200,000 in severance as he continued in his post as if nothing had happened. Romanian authorities were told nothing. So what's going on here? Basically, after reports of abuse had come in, okay, and there were reports of SA from Havsgard, what this attorney is saying, and they're not going to say something. Generally, in a court document like this, in a lawsuit filing, attorneys aren't going to say things that they can't back up. Now, even if they can't fully prove it in court, they're going to be able to back up where this idea came from. They're not just going to say totally random, totally false things. Okay. They can be sanctioned for that. They can face different bar penalties for that. So when you're putting this in writing, this is something that this attorney has good reason to believe and good evidence to believe that this is true, that this is something that they believe they can argue in court. And what he's saying is, hey, after it was reported, the SA was going on, and this guy Havsgard was harming these children, that he was removed, but they acted like nothing was going on. They acted like he was still in his post. That's my understanding here. They acted like he was still running these children's homes, okay? They didn't tell the Romanian authorities, because that's where these orphanages and children's homes, foster homes, whatever you want to call them, that's where they were. But instead, they just tried to quietly make this go away, and they paid the guy a $200,000 severance, is what it says. They paid him a $200,000 severance, which generally is going to be a part of a severance agreement, which more often than not, from my experience, is part of an NDA is a part of that. Non-disclosure is a part of that. When we pay somebody a big severance, there's a reason why we're paying them a big severance. So there's a huge red flag there, okay? People get upset when churches say we use severance agreements. Jeff, you keep calling these NDAs, but we don't think their NDAs were just severance agreements. Something you're literally going to hear in the article and comment response that's coming up next week, right? From one of the nation's largest churches. Okay. They say, well, we just use severance agreements. They're not that bad. Well, more often than not, from my experience, when you see severance agreements, you also see elements of an NDA. And why am I so hard on those? Because the amount of times where we see sin grow to a point to where it's harming tons and tons of people. In this case, 22 plaintiffs have said, my life was completely destroyed. My life was completely changed. I will never be the same because of the pain that I went through here. And when we hear stories like this, how often are severance payments involved? How often are NDAs involved? And this isn't even what the attorney is calling an NDA. But again, sin leaves clues. Should it have been a red flag for anybody? Not just that Havsgard got this severance, but should it have been a red flag for others that were getting severances over the years? Because my hunch, my guess, is that this wasn't the first severance agreement that was made, that this wasn't the first severance payment that was made. So we have authorities not being told, we have reports not being made, but we have severance money paid, which again, in a lot of cases, I don't know about this one, but in a lot of cases, that is to cover things up. And this attorney is going to allege in this lawsuit in multiple different times, multiple different ways, that they believe Greg Laurie and this church, Harvest Bible Chapel, actually worked actively to cover up this man's sin, this man's abuse, for the sake of, not because they were okay with it, not because they were supporting it, but to protect the reputation, they argue, of the church. Okay, so again, there's a lot here. 22, it says, the defendants have continued to conspire in California to cover up these horrors for which they were all responsible. And again, warning, only read this whole thing if you are ready for horrors, because it's gross. I had to stop multiple times. There were just pieces that I simply couldn't read, even out of the 200 pages. When they say horrors, that's not hyperbole. That's not just them trying to paint a picture. The stuff that is in here is absolutely, it's stomach turning. It's nauseating. It is horrific. But he says the defendants continued to conspire to cover up these horrors for which they were all responsible. And the cover up has succeeded for 20 years until now. Okay. Think about Mike Winger's work recently. Think about the work that he's done, not with anybody in particular, not with Bethel or Todd White, but just all of it. What has Mike Winger been talking about for months now, for this whole last year? He's been talking about cover up culture in the church. And sometimes Mike will do videos and people say, man, Mike, you're going overboard. You're getting too worked up over these things. These aren't huge deals, right? There are people who make arguments of why Bethel covering up false prophecies wasn't a big deal, or why he's too hard on Todd White, or why he's too hard on Benny Hinn, this, that, or the other. But Mike knows, I think what we're learning here as well, man, cover up culture, it can start in a way where you could say, well, is that the biggest deal? I mean, that's kind of a small thing. Is it in the grand scheme of things, is that a huge deal? Maybe it's not. Okay. But every time we allow cover up culture to exist in the church, it grows, it gets emboldened. And my fear is if we don't deal with cover up culture when we see it, we don't challenge it, we don't expose it, it's always going to grow. And the cover ups are going to get bigger, and they're going to get nastier, and they're going to get more horrific. Okay. Now, again, these are just allegations, but the allegations, there was a 20-year cover up here. Okay. There were times where people in the church would have said, okay, a 20-year cover up, Jeff, that's not going to happen in the church. But recently we've seen quite a few of these, right? With Dr. Michael Brown, we saw, if I'm not mistaken, multiple decades, over 20 years of covering up his sin and trying to keep it from coming to light. We saw it decades with Mike Bickle. Okay. We've seen it decades, time and time again with Ravi Zacharias. So we've seen more and more and more of these experiences where we say, well, how this was covered up for 20 years. How was it covered up for 20 years? Well, what we keep finding out is because people continued to allow cover up culture to reign. They allowed small things to go by. They saw things that didn't sit right with them, but for the sake of unity and everything else, for the sake of just protecting the status quo and being comfortable, they let it go. And then everybody is sick when we find out how far it grew and how bad it got. But should we be surprised when it gets horrifically bad, when sin in the church gets horrifically bad, if we've allowed leaders to cover things up for 20 years? We allow leaders to get by with these things. In my experience, when a leader gets by with sin, they become more emboldened every time to think they can get by with greater sin the next time. And that's why, whether you're talking about church, whether you're talking about politics, or you're talking about any of it, I believe accountability is a must. Because humans, we're going to try to get by with as much as we can. And I think even good people get corrupted when we cover up for them. The next thing it says, in fact, the Hasgard cover up mirrors many others by Laurie and his senior pastors. I think he's talking about executive pastors there. It's probably what I would call more of executive pastors, including of repeated complaints about senior pastors' extramarital affairs on Harvest Riverside's campus, which resulted in no investigations, but quiet exits. Does that sound familiar? Quiet exits. Again, why do we care about NDAs? Why do we care about when churches spin the narrative on why people left and always make things sound good, but don't give you any information? Because quiet exits are usually a sign of something deeper going on in the culture. And if we would deal with those quiet exits the first time we hear them and say, whoa, we're a church family, tell me more about what's going on. Why did that pastor just disappear? If we deal with that early, we would actually avoid a lot of sin. When we don't deal with it, it comes up in lawsuits like this. They did this multiple times. Now, here's what this person's saying, though. He's saying this Havsgard cover-up is not the only cover-up. He says it's part of a pattern, and you're actually going to see these attorneys, this group of attorneys actually say that this is a playbook, not just a pattern, it's a playbook that Harvest has ran multiple times, and they're going to give reasons for that, why they believe that, and evidence that they think will essentially be able to prove that in court. So we're talking about cover-ups. We're talking about severance payments. We're talking about quiet exits. We're talking about all that stuff. And then they're saying this is a playbook. This is a repeated pattern. How often do we talk about those things? We talk about severance payments. We talk about quiet exits. We talk about NDAs. We talk about we talk about having a playbook and running the same system over and over again. Are you starting to see why we are so hard at SAI on the things that we're hard on? It's because these things are patterns, and they're patterns that almost inevitably will eventually hurt people. Is it always going to happen? No. But more often than not, it's the train wreck that is coming in front of you if we don't have uncomfortable conversations. Okay. Plaintiffs, to the extent applicable here, have pursued their rights diligently. Okay. So the 22 plaintiffs that are filing this suit that say, I was SA'd at the hands of Havsgard. I believe people at Harvest Bible Chapel should have known about this. I believe Greg Laurie should have known about this. My life was damaged because of this. It says they pursued justice essentially diligently, but they were impeded. Okay. Think about that word. Have you heard that before? They were impeded because of extraordinary threats and coercion that the defendants, including Greg Laurie, applied to the plaintiffs during the period of their residency in the Harvest homes. Okay. So what he's saying is these people try to pursue justice for a long time in a lot of different ways, and around essentially every corner and every turn, they were impeded. Okay. There were threats, there was coercion, anything that people could do. And we're talking about church people here. Anything that these church people, these Christian leaders could do to keep them quiet, to keep them from reporting, to keep them from being listened to or heard, they did. Okay. And again, guys, this sounds like a TV show about mob behavior, but it's not. This is a real lawsuit in a real court where 22 plaintiffs are saying this is our experience with the church. Are most churches like this? No. But how many churches are practicing behavior and systems that they think are harmless, like severance agreements? They think are harmless, like, man, we're just spinning. When people leave, we're spinning it because, man, we just don't want to hurt the reputation of the church. We don't want to hurt anybody. We want to make this feel better. Or, we don't have to talk about everything. Let's try to keep these things as quiet as possible. That stuff happens at a lot of churches. And if we allow it to happen, we shouldn't be surprised when it turns into things like this. It also says the defendants conspired to and did fraudulently conceal the SAs perpetrated against the plaintiffs and other Romanian children. So again, they're saying they covered this up intentionally. Okay. That's what's being alleged right here in this lawsuit. Now I'm going to skip a lot of this. You're noticing there are pictures. Every single one of these pictures is a plaintiff, and they start with the pictures of these real life children, guys. And when I say it's horrific reading this stuff and you're putting a face to a name and you're seeing these children, these are real people. Okay. Now, are there false complaints in the church? Are there false accusations? Absolutely. It is rare. It is rare that you see 22 people, guys. 22 people who are willing to say, no, these things happen to me. These things happen to me. I'm going to go through a long lawsuit. I'm going to go through a jury trial. I'm going to demand a jury trial. They're not asking for a settlement. They're just not asking for money. They're saying, I want a jury trial, which means there's a chance I don't get anything, right? But because we want the maximum amount of justice that we can, is my guess. We want this to play out publicly. We want people to see this, okay? But it's not just the 22 witnesses that have come together or the 22 plaintiffs. There are multiple times throughout this where these lawyers will allege something, and then they'll say, because this person said, or this person's testimony, or this. So a lot of this stuff is going to come out. When I have told you before, one of the reasons why churches like to use, even churches that aren't doing nefarious things, one of the reasons why churches and organizations as a whole like to use NDAs and like to use severance agreements that are silencing and stuff like that. Why do they like to do that? They like to do that to avoid lawsuits, okay? Because lawsuits, it's not the monetary damage that does the biggest damage. It's actually the reputational damage that it does. But also they want to stay out of these lawsuits. So what they'll do is things like NDAs are legal threats. If you don't stay quiet about the things we ask you to stay quiet about, if you don't follow the terms of this contract, which generally is staying quiet about something as part of the consideration, then we can come after you. We can take legal action. And you all have seen as we've called out some churches and we've added some ministries to this NDA database. We've had demand letters sent to us by lawyers that basically were threats to sue. Hey, if you report on this, we're going to sue you. And this is one thing I say every time we get those, why we're not bothered. Okay, one, we're pretty confident that we're doing things the right way. We're always trying to do things the right way. I'm very confident that if anybody tries to challenge anything that we report in court, that we can withstand that. We can answer that. We can be above reproach. But also, I know this: a lot of people are scared of lawsuits. A lot of everyday people, we're scared of lawsuits because we can't afford attorneys. We can't do all that sort of thing, right? I'm not scared of a lawsuit because I know what comes with lawsuits. And what comes with lawsuits, if people don't get scared and scatter, what comes with lawsuits is discovery. What potentially comes with a civil lawsuit, if you take it to the end, is a jury trial, a civil trial. Okay. And with those things, all sorts of stuff comes out. So this is just in the filing. There is way more stuff that all of this is going to have to be vetted pretty deeply. There's going to be testimony. There's going to be depositions. There's going to be all of that stuff. It is going to be very, very hard for Greg Laurie and Harvest Bible Chapel to hide anything. And I'm not saying they're trying to hide anything, but if there's anything to hide, it's going to be very, very hard to hide. And it would be almost impossible for this to go very far if none of these things that the attorneys are saying are true. So this is just a tough situation. Okay. But again, if you're out there and you've experienced spiritual abuse from a church, or you've been asked to sign an NDA, or you've experienced those legal threats, again, I'm not a lawyer. I can't give you legal advice or anything like that, but just something to keep in mind. Legal threats are a tool a lot of churches use, but rarely do churches, much more rarely than they want to pursue lawsuits. It is more rare that they would actually want to pursue a lawsuit than they would just want to try to scare you, right? And it's because this stuff does get very messy. And right here you have defendant, because there's multiple defendants here. One of the defendants is the church itself, but you have Greg Laurie, okay? And again, you have Havsgard, you have all of these people, but you have a picture in this lawsuit filed of Greg Laurie preaching. That's not the picture of a pastor preaching that you want out there. It says Laurie is the co-founder and senior pastor of Harvest Riverside. He has supreme authority and makes all important decisions. Not some, not most. He makes all important decisions. That is the assertion, the allegation this attorney is making in court, asking for a jury trial, saying, I'll present this evidence before a jury. Okay, so again, this is a big deal. He says that Greg Laurie has supreme authority, makes all important decisions concerning the church. Again, sin leaves clues. Okay, I'm not saying there's sin here, but if this sin, these allegations are true, then it's going to make a lot more sense when you see a lot of these things that are happening. Because how often do we hear about, when we hear about an abusive leader, we also hear that they have supreme authority. How often do we talk about it in churches? People get so upset. I'll give you another example. People get so upset when we talk about ARC, the Association of Related Churches, when we talk about Chris Hodges and Church of the Highlands. I did a video over a year ago about Chris Hodges' transition, right, out of senior leadership. People still leave comments on the regular upset about that. People get really, really mad. Well, Jeff, I agree with some of the stuff that you do. I agree with your heart, but you're going too far when you start challenging ARC, or you start challenging these pastors, and you're challenging them because of systems, not because of sin, but because of systems. Don't you think you're a little too hard on them, Jeff? And I always say, no, I don't think I'm too hard on them. And here's the reason why: because these systems lead to results. Okay. Yes, they lead to growing churches, but what's one of the things we talked about with ARC that people get so mad about? The kind of recommended governance system in a lot of ARC churches. It's what I would call supreme authority. That there's very few people that can actually hold the pastor accountable, and the stars kind of have to align to be able to hold the pastor accountable, because the pastor is the king of these churches. Literally, in those recommended bylaws, we went over them last year in an episode, and in those recommended bylaws, it says the pastor is like the spiritual leader and shepherd, but the pastor holds a dual role. The second role is the CEO of the organization, and they're basically handpicking their board, they're handpicking their trustees, they're handpicking their elders, they're handpicking their overseers, right? So it is very difficult to hold them accountable. So when I see this here, supreme authority, it doesn't surprise me. And when people get upset and they say, Jeff, you're too hard on systems like ARC, I would tell them, with all due respect, I don't think you're hard enough, because I think there are a lot of great pastors in ARC churches. There are a lot of people who really do love Jesus and just want to see people come to know Jesus and be changed by the gospel in the Association of Related Churches. Okay. I don't think all these guys are bad guys. But what I will say is, I don't think humans, when you give us supreme authority in a church, or you give someone almost unchecked authority in a church, I don't think it ever ends well. It's why I'm not a voting member of the SAI board, because I don't need authority. What I need people is, I need people to hold me accountable. I need people to check me, because again, humans are going to human. We are going to make mistakes. And I know it seems as a struggle for a lot of these pastors. I know unchecked authority does not look good on me. It's not just me. I know unchecked authority doesn't look good on you. It doesn't look good on any of us. Okay. So supreme authority, sin leaves clues. When you see a church where the pastor or a group of pastors has almost supreme authority, there's concern. I'm not going to say there's a problem, but there's high concern, and there's a high likelihood, I believe, of problems coming. One person, a couple people can't make all the decisions. Okay. There's a lot more stuff there. By the way, that's just weird. And I know they put that there because it is going to hit weird. It is going to feel weird, but this just reminds us, the evangelical industrial complex, we've gotten so big that we got, a pastor here who a lot of people love, but then in this court document, it's just, even if some of these allegations are false, or even if all of them are false, this is just fodder that they've given people because his face is on a 18-wheeler on a truck. It's just, it's weird. We need to come back to some humility, I think, as pastors in the church. But it says Laurie's wood-paneled office is full of pictures of him in the company of important politicians, religious leaders, and actors. Is there anything sinful about taking pictures with politicians, celebrities, actors, sports figures? No, there's nothing sinful about that. But it is a red flag. And a red flag doesn't mean sin, but a red flag is, hey, when we see this, is there often, or even just, more than like 10% of the time, is there something else going on here? Okay. And I think about this when I think about full of pictures of him in the company of important politicians, religious leaders, and actors. I think about, and guys, not to trash anybody, but y'all know, if you've been watching the podcast, my opinions, and my stance on pastors like Landon Schott. Well, I pointed out a lot of issues I have with Landon Schott. I pointed out why I believe he's biblically disqualified, why I believe he's dangerous as pastor, my opinion. And I pointed out biblically why I hold that theological opinion. I've laid out all of that evidence. Okay. But at the same time, one of the kind of red flags, the things that didn't sit well with me early on in my spirit, was watching, Landon's seeming desire to get close to different people in politics, and all that stuff when Trump took office and everything else. He's been to DC multiple times, the people he takes pictures with. And that's just one example. We see this all the time. So every time you see a picture or a pastor taking pictures with well-known people, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Okay. But it could be the sign of something else. And I'm not saying it's even the cause of anything with Landon Schott, right? But what I am saying is sin leaves clues. So when you see this, it doesn't mean there's sin there. But if you're seeing this and you're seeing other things, when something doesn't sit right in your spirit, it's worth asking questions about. Okay. It's not worth making accusations about, because you could be wrong, but it's worth asking questions about. And if a person's above reproach, if a leader's above reproach, they're going to be able to answer your questions in a way that I believe calms your spirit, because you have the spirit of truth in you. That is what the Holy Spirit, one of the names, the Holy Spirit is called by the Spirit of truth. Okay. The Spirit of truth is inside of you, and you're going to know truth when you hear it, when you were seeking it. James says, if anyone lacks wisdom, pray, and God is generous to give wisdom to anybody who asks. Okay. So if you're, hey, I got to check in my spirit, I'm going to ask these questions, I'm looking for wisdom, you're going to be able to recognize that. We got to trust the Holy Spirit inside of us. Okay. So again, when you see something that doesn't sit right with your spirit, maybe like, man, this pastor seems to be taking pictures with celebrities all the time and kind of hobnobbing it with all these important people, and they kind of, just throwing that out there. Something doesn't sit right with me about that. It's okay to ask questions. Don't lead with accusations. Don't lead with distrust, but ask questions and then trust what the Holy Spirit is doing inside of you. And even if you don't find good answers to that. That is probably not enough to really say or do anything. But what it does, it keeps our eyes open. We say, are there any other red flags that I'm missing? Because guys, we don't want to look for red flags because we're going to find them. Okay, we're humans. We don't want to look for red flags everywhere we go, but we also don't want to ignore red flags. And the more red and yellow flags that we're finding somewhere, we do have to remember that sin leaves clues. And if we just ignore them all the time, we're no better than if we see them around every corner. Okay. We've got to be people who care about the truth. Okay. We're not just looking for red flags because we expect them. We're not dismissing them because they make us uncomfortable. We're seeking the truth. Okay. Let me see. Right there, you've actually got a picture of Greg, Laurie, and his wife with the actors that played them in Jesus Revolution in the film. The lawsuit names that film multiple times just because the money that is made. There's other defendants there. You see right here, defendant Harvest Christian Fellowship. that is the church. A couple of other things. This is small, and again, I talk about some of these things a lot, and people go, Jeff, these things are small. Why are they a big deal? When they're showing up in lawsuits like this, and attorneys are using them to paint a picture of kind of people's character and how they got where they are, okay, how they covered things up, which is what is alleged here. I think that is important. Okay, what if instead of it getting here, what if people had been willing to ask some of those ticky tack questions earlier? Okay, so this is going to seem small to some of you, but I think it's something we have to pay attention to. It's not the end all be all, but something we have to pay attention to. Laurie did not attend college or seminary, and he's not the only one. Okay, he is not the only one. You're going to see that a couple of other times. Didn't attend college or seminary. Didn't attend college or seminary. You don't have to attend college or seminary to be a pastor. You don't have to attend college or seminary to know how to study the Bible. Okay, but here's where the concern comes in. There's been a massive trend that I have seen in the last 20 years as I've been in ministry, where the trend has moved away from what used to be. When I first got into ministry, most people, it felt like if you were going into ministry, you had to go to seminary. Okay, you just had to. You didn't have hardly any opportunities that were open. By the time I stepped out of ministry, the majority of the people that we were putting in ministry were like, somewhere between 18 and 24. And we're pulling in these young people. Someone's pulling them out of college. I'm saying you don't need experience. We'll teach you as you go. Okay. And you're getting a lot of people who are talented. Okay. We see talent in them. Let's pull them into ministry. We see gifting in them. Let's pull them into ministry. So you're taking young people with gifting, we're putting them into ministry, but they're not having to go through the rigors because I think, when I was going to school and everything else, when you go through the seminary experience, there are parts of your character that are tested there, right? There are parts of your character that I think are shown there. That's not an end all be all, but I wonder sometimes, and again, this is just like a yellow flag for me, but it's something that I pay attention to when you have these big charismatic pastors and leaders of churches, whether they're young or whether they're older, like Greg Laurie, and they didn't go to seminary, they didn't do anything like that. They didn't even go back later when they had the means and the time. It just raises some questions, okay, for me, because often, not all the time, not even maybe most of the time, but too often, um, they've just kind of never been checked and they've been allowed to rely on their talents. Okay, doesn't mean there's sin there on its own, but it can lead to a lot of other ego type things. So it's just something to pay attention to, right? It talks about Lonnie Frisbee. If you've watched Jesus Revolution, it kind of talks about Lonnie Frisbee a little bit. Lonnie Frisbee was kind of this iconic character who was behind a lot of the Jesus Revolution type movement and stuff like that. But it says Frisbee's widow, Connie, says, and again, this is part of that. They don't just make allegations and say, we think we can prove these in court. A lot of times they're saying, no, we've actually got people who will testify. We've got people who've said it. We put them on record, right? So we can go deeper into this. But Frisbee's widow, Connie, says, I can testify that Greg Laurie is not a truth teller. Why does that say that? The attorney is putting that in there likely just to let the judge know we've got witnesses that will testify. We can put them on the stand. We can go deep into this. We're not just making this stuff up. Frisbee's widow, Connie, says, I can testify that Greg Laurie is not a truth teller. Now, I don't know if she's right. I don't know if Greg Laurie could be one of the most honest people on the planet. But what I can tell you is the Bible says that an elder is to be above reproach. That's not above reproach to me. When I look at that, that doesn't seem above reproach. It is a big red flag anytime we have anybody say about a pastor, even if they're the pastor of a 20-person church. Okay. Anytime you say about a pastor, they're not a truth teller, that's a problem. That's a problem for any Christian when we kind of say they're not a truth teller. And this person says, I can testify in court under oath, hand on heart, hand on Bible before God. He's not a truth teller. Just does not look good. He's built his ministry on Lonnie's foundation while erasing Lonnie from the story. Now, that may seem small as well. And you may say, well, okay, so maybe he erased Lonnie from the story a little bit. He embellished about what he did and minimized what Lonnie did in this, in this film, Jesus Revolution. But maybe he did that over the years and started to believe that. But come on, Jeff, we all tell little white lies and stuff like that. But there's a couple of problems with this. Okay, one, when we get comfortable telling white lies, okay, and if you're a parent, you probably told your kids this. When we get comfortable telling white lies, we eventually get comfortable telling big black lies, big, bold black lies. Okay. So I just wonder if early on when he was telling these stories about Lonnie, if somebody like Connie felt like she was able to check him, right? Could that have actually prevented these allegations, people being hurt, or even allegations of people being hurt down the road? But more than that, it actually says that, and again, this is on record in the court filing, the producers of Jesus Revolution did not speak to her, she says, after Laurie told them that she was dead. So not only does Lonnie Frisbee's ex-wife Connie, or late wife Connie, say, I can testify that Greg's not a truth teller, she says that Greg Laurie, and from her vantage point, told the producers of Jesus Revolution that she was dead. Now, if that's the truth, that's going to come out in court. If that's not the truth, that's going to come out in court. But again, you're not going to find many attorneys who are going to put that in there if they don't think they can prove that, right? Because that is going to make them look pretty bad. Not being a truth teller, and if this is true, if he told the producers of the Jesus Revolution that she was dead, so they shouldn't talk to her, like that is a massive moral failure and massive sin for a pastor if true. Okay. It says it's talking about Harvest, okay, is a member of Calvary Chapel, a non-denominational association of evangelical churches. But in 2017, Harvest Riverside joined the Southern Baptist Convention, which was considered a coup for Southern Baptists because of Laurie's prominence in the evangelical movement. Okay. There's nothing huge here. One, I just think it's important to note when we find people who are prominent in a movement, and again, we talked about with Bethel, the more people talk about a movement, the more uneasy my spirit gets, the more my body sense starts tingling. Okay. But it says because he was prominent in the evangelical movement, it was like a big win for the Southern Baptist Convention to get him. Okay. But again, this is just a reminder as well. This is why we say it's important for churches, and we encourage churches, let your people know, like be willing to go public about your affiliations. If you're a part of ARC, don't hide it. If you're a part of ARC, you think ARC is a good organization. We can disagree on whether or not it's the best organization for your church to be a part of. Okay, that's fine, but own it. Let people know, because if someone's coming to your church and they have an issue with ARC, it's better for them to know that than to find out later and feel like they were hoodooed. Okay, the same thing here. I don't know. Maybe they were very clear about this, but I can see people in the Calvary Chapel movement, some of them having concern about being a part of the Southern Baptist Convention, and some people in the Southern Baptist movement or the Southern Baptist denomination or convention, however you want to call it, being concerned about being a part of Calvary Chapel, right? I can see some of those concerns. So I hope that they were honest about those things. They were forthcoming about those things. When they're not, again, sin leads clues. A lot of times that is one of those small concessions. Well, we're honest if somebody asks us, but we're not going to be forthcoming about it, okay? And I'm going to talk about this in a later episode. We actually talk about it a good bit in the NDA article that is coming up. But there's a difference between being transparent and translucent. Transparent means see-through, okay? I'm letting you see whatever's going on. Like with SAI, we want to be transparent with our finances. We're just going to let you see, okay? We want to be transparent with our board meetings. We're just going to let you, we're going to let you see. We're proactive in putting things together in case anybody needs them, right? Translucence is we'll let some light in, but only under certain conditions, right? Yeah, well, I mean, if a church member asks and jumps through 8 hoops, then we'll let them see part of the budget, right? Um, we want to find churches. I encourage people, the healthiest, safest churches are going to be ones that are proactively transparent. They're just see through because they have nothing to hide, rather than ones that are translucent. Translucent churches, it doesn't mean that they are sinful, but there's a much higher likelihood of things going wrong and things moving to sin and sheep getting hurt in a church that chooses translucence over transparency, um, in a lot of spots. So it's just something to pay attention to. You see, again, you're talking about Havsgard, the person who is alleged to have actually perpetrated this essay of children and have been covered up for. I said that he took some college classes, but does not have a degree and did not attend seminary. Again, another small thing, but we're seeing more and more and more of that. And while I don't think seminary is the end all be all, I wonder if I wonder if we're missing something pretty important by just throwing talented people into ministry these days. Um, Let me see. Talking about Havsgard's wife and some concerns that she had, it said that Laurie told her it was her duty as a Christian wife. So she goes to her pastor. He told her it was her duty as a Christian wife to make the marriage work, and she ultimately adopted this approach. She was later to say that according to the beliefs prevailing at Harvest, and this is her opinion, but again, they're saying she said this, so we've got it on record, or can get it on record, can get her to testify that she said this. She was later to say that according to the beliefs prevailing at Harvest, a wife who criticized or contradicted her husband was, quote, lower than a sewer. And again, they put that quote in there for a reason. Your Honor, in a jury trial, we can get all of this out under oath, okay? But again, there's red flags here. Sin leaves clues. Yes, we want marriages to work. Yes, God cares about marriage. But more often than not, when we see a pastor who is telling women, or even telling men for that matter, but it's usually they're telling women, hey, you need to do whatever you can to make this work. And only by making this marriage work and honoring your husband and submitting, only then can you honor God. Well, man, think about the situation at John MacArthur's church. And you got this woman who says, I was struggling. And I can't even remember her name right now, but you can go back, you can read it. There's plenty of articles and stuff on it. I was struggling because I felt my children were being abused by this person. I went to the church. I didn't get any support. I was told I needed to fix my marriage. And I was excommunicated because I left my husband, only for later for her husband to be imprisoned because he was guilty of doing some of the things that she said and actually harming her children, right? That stuff is deeply damaging. And I don't know what Harvest Bible knew, but anytime there's someone who feels like, even when I've got concerns about my marriage, I have to stay because that's the only way I can please God, I think that is dangerous. Being the son of a mom who went through some domestic abuse situations, I can tell you that is dangerous. And that's not the advice that I would give as a pastor, because I've seen what happens in real life with it. But maybe more importantly, when it says that according to the beliefs prevailing at Harvest, and I don't know that these are actually their beliefs, but this is what she thinks their beliefs are. It's what she felt. A wife who criticized or contradicted her husband was lower than a sewer. That is actually the bigger red flag here to me, because whether it's talking about the husband being head of the wife, or whether it's talking about church leaders, you got to honor the man of God. When you have a religious organization or a church that constantly tells you it is sin to criticize, it is sin to question, it is sin to contradict, right? And look, there are maybe places where that becomes true, but often what you see is when somebody's teaching that, they're just saying, don't question us, trust us implicitly, listen to whatever we say. And they're saying you can't think here, because when you think here, that is dangerous. And this is something that you do see a lot in cover-up culture. Okay. And again, I don't know that it's cover-up culture for sure at Harvest Bible Chapel or with Greg Laurie, although this stuff doesn't look good. I'll just be honest, it doesn't look good. But that's why you go through the whole court process. People are innocent until proven guilty, okay? But if this is true and the beliefs were you can't criticize your husband, then it's not a very far jump from that to, well, you can't honor God by criticizing your pastor or asking questions. And do you see how that leads to cover-up culture? We hear about that all the time in churches that have covered up deep sin. When Havsgard, again, the person who perpetrated this essay allegedly, When Havsgard returned to Harvest Riverside in 1984, many people viewed him as the second most powerful pastor next to Laurie and a possible competitor for the top job. It was a new entrepreneurial organization growing rapidly. Okay. Now, so let's just stop there. That is gross to me. Okay. And that is a huge red flag because I've been in churches much more recently than 1984. I have been in churches. I have sat with church leaders who talk about church like that. What does pastor mean? Pastor means shepherd. What was a shepherd? A shepherd was someone who got dirty. It was a demeaning job because you were all about serving those sheep, protecting those sheep, feeding those sheep, making sure that those dirty animals stayed alive. You would give up yourself for those sheep, for the health of the flock. That's not how they're talking about a pastor here. They're not talking about serving. They're not talking about humility. It said that when he came in 1984, many people viewed him as the second most powerful pastor. It is a red flag when we see, or pastors see, or anybody in the church sees pastors as powerful people. Because pastors, biblically, I believe, are actually Christians who give up power to serve. Pastors lead with towels, not titles. Okay. So if whether they're saying they have power or other people are constantly trying to ascribe them power, that is a problem. We can ascribe honor without ascribing power. Okay. But not only that, it says he was a possible competitor for the top job, like the CEO of the church, like the senior pastor. And again, that sounds super gross, but that was in 1984. And when we talked about the recommended bylaws from ARC, what did we see? The pastor is the CEO of the organization. It's the top job. And why is it the top job? Because nobody can question the top job. This is how they were talking about this according to this court docket. It's how they saw it and how they were talking about it decades ago, 40 something years ago. They talked about it not as a church, not as the body of Christ, not as a local community of believers, but as an entrepreneurial organization growing rapidly. That kind of language is concerning to me and is a big red flag. But it also says neither Laurie nor Havsgard had worked outside of the Calvary movement, which did not have established traditions or specific credentials required for leadership. That meant that personal followings were an important barometer for pastors. Another red flag when whether they say it or whether they show it with their actions. When pastors become just almost obsessed in a way with their personal following or talking about their personal following or building their brand, I think that can be a big red flag. Like, look, there's nothing wrong with a big brand. SAI has a lot of followers on social media and a big brand. And we also kind of disappear from social media sometimes. It's probably not a good move, but sometimes everything's so busy. We're ran by volunteers. Man, I'm not on social media as much as I should be. And like my personal Instagram barely exists anymore because I don't want that platform. Not because I'm special or better than somebody else. I've seen how it corrupts. I've seen how it can corrupt. Okay. But also it comes up again. They didn't go to college. They didn't go to seminary. Neither of these guys had ever worked outside of the Calvary movement. Okay. We have a lot of people who get into ministry today. They're shoulder tapped really early on. Hey, come to our ministry network, our ministry school, whatever. We see talent in you. We want to get you into the church. You have a lot of people who do that. They're talented, and then they're in their 40s, 50s, 60s. They've never worked outside the church. And guys, I went to seminary. I went to college. I had worked outside the church a little bit, but most of my life was spent in the church. And I'm going to tell you, when I needed to step outside of the local church to be able to have these conversations, it was hard. It was hard because I was looking at it and saying, man, I'm in my mid 30s and I don't know what to do. I don't know what I can do outside of the church. It was a real crisis point for me. And at times it's still what I'm trying to figure out. Like, what is my long-term, career? Because I've started businesses, I've done things, I do contract work, I do a lot of different things to make the ends meet, but I still have a bit of an identity crisis. That's what a lot of people are going through. And I think it's a question we have to ask about churches. Again, sin leaves clues. Are we pushing people into unhealthy situations? Are we pushing church leaders in unhealthy situations by bringing in leaders and molding leaders based on their talent without training? And then we build their whole career around the church and they don't know what they would do outside of the church. I think that causes people to hold on because I don't know how else I'd make money. I don't know how else I would do, all of this sort of stuff. I don't know where else I would get these accolades. And all of a sudden you can easily have people in. I don't think this is the majority of pastors at all, but you can easily get church leaders and pastors who find themselves in it for the wrong reasons because they don't see any other opportunity. So I just think it's something that has to be asked. Okay, talking about Havsgard, it's talking about he was well known, he's well thought of it early on in his ministry, but it says he was also known to be volatile, to have a big ego that required constant praise. Okay, and then it talks about some organizational issues as well. But he was young, he was well thought of, perhaps the competitor for the top job, one of the most powerful leaders in the church, but they're essentially saying in this lawsuit that they believe they can prove he was also known by people to be volatile, have a big ego, and required constant praise. That does not sound like a pastor. Is it possible? Again, sin leaves clues. The road to sin is littered with breadcrumbs. Okay. We don't just all of a sudden we're in sin. No, there's a road to sin. Is it possible that from the very beginning with Havsgard, that people overlooked character deficiencies because he was talented? Is it possible that we do that a lot today in the church? And is it possible that a lot of the pain and heartache that people go through is because we overlook character because people are talented? Again, guys, there's just so much here. It talks more about Laurie's position of supreme authority, right? And it goes on. It talks about a lot of financial issues that they allege here, like the Harvest Homes in Romania being a fundraising vehicle for Laurie and Riverside, sharing employees and management, working for two organizations. That sounds a lot like when Nathan Apfel and I were talking before the religion business documentary, and we were talking about auxiliaries and stuff like that, where basically it's easier for churches to have shell nonprofits underneath them, and then they don't have to report that income because there's no major report. They could say, well, the church only brings in this, spends this, and not count. We heard from like Stovall Weems in a podcast last year talking about it, where he said, when you counted all of our auxiliaries and stuff, we were making tens of millions, probably more than we were making if we just told people what the church was making. This almost looks like sharing employees and management between this organization called ARC, different ARC, but still called ARC, with Harvest Riverside. So there's kind of financial double dealing and almost a like shell corporation type thing going on there. The church and Laurie effectively controlling this other nonprofit organization. They talk about that concern. You're going to see other stuff here. For years, Harvest Riverside deposited large sums of money, supposedly designated for Harvest Homes and this ministry operating costs. They deposited it for years directly into Havsgard personal bank account. Okay, they talk about this multiple times throughout the lawsuit. Okay, and then Havsgard used large portions of these funds to buy things for himself, as well as abundant presents and alcohol for his child SA victims to keep them pliant, and to buy silence from Harvest staff about the SA, about the child SA. And again, they come back to this multiple times. If you remove the child SA from it and you just look at, as hard as that is, if you remove those allegations and you just look at the financial stuff of we're kind of double dealing and sharing, management and employees between this church and this other ministry, and effectively people are saying, this pastor in this church is running this ministry, and you overlook them depositing, they're using it as a fundraising vehicle. They're depositing money directly into somebody's personal bank account with no checks and balances to see where it goes and stuff like that. Again, those are big red flags. When there isn't financial accountability and financial control, I believe sin is more likely to grow. And people get upset with us a lot because there are quite a few people I know that I love, that I respect, that disagree with me on my financial takes, because they say, Jeff, you require things of the church that the Bible doesn't require of the church. And the church doesn't have to do these things legally, this, that, and the other. And the reason why I'm so hard on it, and maybe I am too hard on it, but I'd rather be too hard on it than too lax on it, because where you see financial issues in a church, you will often find other issues of sin that grow out of it. I believe that to my core. from my experience. Okay. There were no proper accounts or financial audits, no regular inspections of harvest homes. There were no child protection policies or training, child protection policies and trainings, proper accounts, all that sort of stuff. That stuff we talk about in the Safe Church Pledge. That stuff that should be there. Why is it in the Safe Church Pledge? Because we know where those things don't exist, scandal is more likely to happen. Okay. And guys, there's some crazy stuff there. Like, trying to even decide what to say there. There were essentially allegations within Havsgard's family that they bring up. People who they believe would testify here in quotes. There are people from within Havsgard's family that accused him of the R word, accused him of SA over the years before he was doing ministry with children and before he was doing, leading these children's homes. And they not only brought this up to their family, but it details how they allegedly brought it up to Laurie in the church, and just or things didn't happen. Different people within the church. So that's what all of this is about. People being told, telling their supervisors, but nothing happened. And I'm going past that because it's very graphic. It's very, very graphic, some of the things that they describe there. And again, I don't want to be traumatizing for anybody. Laurie Shute in Harvest Riverside sent Havsgard approximately $17,000 a month. $17,000 a month, which in Romania at that time had huge purchasing power. Okay. If any of y'all are making $17,000 a month, like I want to get to know you. Maybe we could talk about you donating to SAI. Normal people I know today in 2026 are not making $17,000 a month. Okay. They were sending Havsgard to his personal bank account, is what is alleged here, $17,000 a month. That is basically half of all of what SAI brought in the whole year last year. And that was not now. That was like before inflation and stuff, and not in America, in Romania. So they're saying this is like massive purchasing power. Okay. And it says, by comparison, Steve Quarles, another American minister working in Romania at the same time, so you got another missionary in the same area, was able to provide for his family of 8 and run 3 different churches and pay an assistant for $1,400 a month. So this guy ran a church, paid another employee, and was able to take care of his family of 8 for $1,400 a month when Harvest was paying Havsgard $17,000 a month, and then just sending it to his personal bank account is what this is saying. Okay. And again, that's all going to be proven out in court. That's the allegations. The struggle here, though, is it's hard to believe that there's no evidence of this and that these lawyers are just making this all completely up. Okay. I don't know what can be proven in court. We're going to see. There's a lot of smoke here to not say it's reasonable that there's likely some fire. Okay. And I think that's just where we got to be. Okay. There's reproach here. We don't know what reproach is valid, but until the reproach is stood against, until the reproach is handled, until we have clear truth, I don't see how Harvest is not looking at this and saying, okay, there's enough here. Why don't we put Greg on leave, even if it's paid leave, and just say, hey, man, we got to let the truth come out on some of these things before we just let people continue doing ministry, because there's a lot of big allegations here. Okay, so again, the lavish payment without the financial controls, we talk about those financial issues all the time. Why? Because they tend to show up on the back end of scandals where you see these things were going on for a long time and nobody called them on it. What happens if we call them earlier? What happens if we demand more transparent financial practices and we ask questions about things, right? If we do that early, I think we can avoid a lot of impropriety. It's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to follow the rules that we've literally set, that I had a part of setting for SAI. But we don't do it because it's easy. It is uncomfortable. It is frustrating. We do it because it's the best way to do it, in our opinion, to be above reproach, because that's what we're trying to do. It says defendants set the funds from California directly into Havsgard's personal bank account again. So like I said, they mentioned that multiple times in different ways as well. Also, we haven't stopped and talked about a lot of this, but they've got newspaper articles. They've got all kinds of different things. They put quite a bit of evidence just in this filing. Quite a bit of stuff there. In winter of 2002, the Calvary Chapel magazine asked for donations to help Havsgard's work, but it listed the same phone number that Harvest used. and all of their fundraising materials that it talks about use that same phone number. So again, there's the enmeshment and entangling of two separate organizations, one basically being run as a shell company. It would look like, it would appear, by the church. Always a red flag to me because of the impropriety it can lead to. Doesn't necessarily do that, but it can lead to those things. And guys, I could keep going. There is a ton of stuff here. 200 pages of this. Again, just a lot of stuff. Okay. You can read this if you want. You can go through all of it. But what it is we see a lot of red flags, a lot of the same things that we have talked about over and over and over again with different churches. A lot of the things that people will say often, these are not big deals, yet we see them show up in scandal after scandal after scandal. And regardless of what turns out to be true and what turns out to be false, in this Greg Laurie situation, I think we can say when there's a 200-page court filing like this, with these things being said and evidence and quotes and testimony offered, I think we can at least say, regardless of what's true, this is a scandal. This looks bad for the church. This is going to be another thing that erodes trust in the church. So when I talk to pastors and I challenge them to do hard things, to be above reproach, one of the things I tell them often is, guys, this isn't just to protect other people. It's not just to protect parishioners. It's to protect you, because when you do these things, when you go the extra mile, when someone makes an allegation, right? It should be easy if you're doing these things easy. Somebody makes an allegation about us sending money to this guy. Well, no, we got all of the records of how we sent the money. Those aren't the amounts. It's easy to prove that, right? All of these things, it's easy to prove against if you have good systems in place. And if you offer transparency, again, proactively, we're just going to be see-through. When you offer translucence, we're only going to let some things through. We decide what light you get to see. Or if you offer opaqueness, we're just going to hide the stuff and say, you just got to trust us, because that's what honoring the man of God looks like. When you choose that instead, it's hard to withstand the reproach. So when I'm challenging pastors on this, that is something I'm continually talking about now, is this beyond protecting the sheep, which should matter to you. That should be enough. But if it's not, this actually protects everybody involved, and this protects you, right? The only thing it doesn't protect is it doesn't protect cover up culture. So guys, this is heavy. And I know some of you are probably gonna be like, man, why we talk so long about the court document? Why'd you go through all of this? Well, guys, this is one where there's been a lot of people come out of the woodworks and they've demonized Julie Roys for writing about this. It's not surprising, because Greg is well known. And again, none of us can say what is true and what is not. But there's enough in this court filing to say, okay, Julie's been talking about this, and whatever you think about Julie, this seems like it was worth talking about. And there's a whole lot of people who are saying, Julie's chasing ghosts. She's talking about stuff. There's no evidence. There's 0, 0, 0, blah, blah. No. Over 200 pages of court documents right now. There's a lot of smoke to this fire. It's worth us talking about. Okay. And not only that, when I read it today, all I could think of is these are the same things. They're talking about, these are the same things. They're detailing, there were the same red flags that we consistently see in scandals, right? They're talking about seeing those people, seeing those and being willing to testify they saw those as early as 1984, right? Well, what if we dealt with those red flags 42 years ago? What if none of these 22 plaintiffs, none of these 22 people said, hey, when I was a child, I went through SA at the hands of a minister? What if they didn't have to do that and there was no court docket, because much smaller things were taken care of and people were held accountable at an earlier age? What if people paid attention not just to Havsgaard's talent in the 80s and him being potentially up for the top job in the church and this powerful, talented dude? What if they paid attention to the character concerns that were raised? What if they listened to people in his family who say, we told people, right? And again, I'm assuming that, I'm having to assume some things here. I'm assuming that there's at least some truth to some of these things, but I don't know what's true. I don't know what is not. It's just hard to believe that all of this is untrue. Are there places where if I just grant that much of what the attorneys are saying has some truth to it, okay, then it looks like there were hundreds, if not thousands, if not tens of thousands of opportunities for people to have hard conversations and deal with much lesser sin before it grew into bigger sin. Because if they dealt with the potential character issues, we don't even know if Havsgard would have continued being a minister that whole time, and then he wouldn't have had access to, children. Maybe he would, because he had to prove that there was nothing going on there. But he says, you know what, I learned early on in ministry, let's just say that everything he says is true, and there's no smoke there, and these are all just false allegations. Well, then wouldn't somebody like that have learned and said, well, I learned early on in ministry, people can make false accusations, so I need to be above reproach, which means, man, I'm not doing these things alone. I have systems to protect me. I'm going to be proactively transparent. Again, I just see I see thousands of off ramps where Harvest Bible Chapel could have avoided this, where it looks like Greg Laurie could have avoided this, even if they're innocent and it's just what they could have avoided, the church looking bad like this, right? Thousands of off ramps where they didn't choose to take them because it was more comfortable to keep moving in the same direction. That is my concern with the church. So when I say sin leaves clues, they're breadcrumbs all the way on the path to sin. Okay. And if we're not paying attention to those breadcrumbs, then we're just going to get to sin fat and happy. And we're going to justify it. We're going to rationalize it. We're going to make excuses for it. But if we'll pay attention, we'll ask hard questions, we'll have uncomfortable conversations. We don't do it because we want to be hard on our pastors. We don't do it because we want to be hard on our churches. We do it because the kingdom matters. And we do it because we're representing Jesus. And there is nothing about, regardless of what comes out and this is the truth, there is nothing about 22 people filing a lawsuit and saying, I was essayed as a child by a minister and it was covered up. There's nothing about that that points people to Jesus. Nothing. So we should be willing to have hard conversations and build in protective systems and fight for transparency, if nothing else, to remove these kinds of things when they're false and make them to where when they are true, where they are noticed so much earlier that people's lives aren't destroyed and there's not so much at stake. So what are some lessons that you've learned from this one? When you look at this one, what are some takeaways that you take out of this, lessons that you've learned for how we can learn from this, learn from these breadcrumbs to keep something like this from happening again? And again, it's not the only one that we're talking about on the stream today, but that's the one that we're talking about for this segment. So I would love to hear from you in the chat, hear from you in the comments, because if we don't learn lessons from this, we are doomed to repeat it. And some of this sounds like Ravi Zacharias. Some of this sounds like Bill Hybels. Some of this sounds like Dr. Michael Brown. And some of this sounds like Mike Bickle. And some of this sounds, I mean, it sounds like Bethel. It sounds like, I can keep going through and I say, hey, I hear the similarities because these same things keep happening. And guys, sin leaves clues. When we find a church where sin has grown, we're going to find a lot of the same red flags, a lot of the same compromises, a lot of the same excuses. So I think it's time as the church that we demand a higher level of honesty and transparency and integrity from our churches and church leaders, if nothing else, to protect everybody involved, including them. There's no reason not to. So we're reaching out to hundreds of churches this month, and thousands, tens of thousands of churches, over the next couple of years, over 1,000 this year, about joining the Safe Church Pledge. And that's why. That's why we don't charge for it. It's why we make it simple, because we're simply trying to offer an olive branch that says, hey, it's better for everybody in the kingdom when we fight for integrity. And we stop asking, what is the thing I legally have to do? And we start asking, what biblically is the most integrous thing that I could do? But one thing I would ask you to do, I would ask you to pray for truth in this situation, that truth would come out in court, to pray for any of the people who are victimized and hurt that this comes out about. Guys, this is not easy. This is damaging. And again, we don't know what the truth is in every situation, but pray for any of those victims, pray for everybody involved, pray for truth, because this is a bad one. And I think this is going to be something that we're probably going to be talking about for years, because this court, if this actually goes to court and it doesn't get dismissed and they've got their ducks in a row, this is going to be around for a while. And this is not one it's just not going to be good. It's not going to be good for anybody involved. So anyway, that's it for this segment. We'll be back with another one soon. But until then, guys, grace and peace. I love you. And we'll continue the conversation on the next one. But in the meantime, let me go ahead. That was our longest segment. So let me just jump into the chat, see the stuff that is there. If there's anything that you guys are wanting to talk about. Homeland says, I spent most of my adult life reaching out to churches and monastic ministries. My bad, switch that. Um, and I was hurt by most of them. I found more empathy and understanding and freedom to speak in places like recovery ministries. I'm guessing oh yeah, he actually says that things like AA, they that let me talk about things as a Christian, talk about God. That is sad commentary. I agree, Homeland. I hate that that was your experience, but I appreciate you. Appreciate you sharing it. The church should be the safest place on the planet. I just believe that to share your doubts, your fears, your confusion. I think Jesus can meet us in those places so powerfully, and it always breaks my heart when it's not. And sometimes it's in those Christian ministries, sometimes it's in non-Christian ministries that allow you to be authentically a person of faith, where you experience that. But that's one of the reasons why we fight this fight so hard, is because I want to see the church again have a reputation for being the safest place on the planet where people can show up. Um, Homeland says again, I heard Greg Laurie listing sins, and he included the homeless with the sins. That told me a lot about him. I don't know about that. I couldn't really speak to it unless I heard it. But if that's true, and like you listed homelessness as a sin, that would be definitely a red flag. Um, Homeland also says the biggest reason for men not being in churches is because men will confront leadership. Um, and the same kind of the same reason that I'm not really sure what that's supposed to say, but I do agree, Homeland. I think a lot of, I don't know if it's the biggest reason, but I think there are a lot of men who love Jesus who struggle in the church because um, they almost feel like I'm not being asked to think, I'm not being asked to ask questions, I'm not being asked to be a part of this, I'm not being asked to lead and bring my God given gifts. I met quite a few men who would say, I felt like I was just relegated to, when you're at church, just do your job in the parking ministry. Check all the other things at the door, because we're not wanting to have uncomfortable conversations. Now, there are churches that do well with that, and I think a lot of men flock to that. Um, but man, I've seen passionate men just get almost turned off by ministry in the church and start working with nonprofit, ministries, parachurch ministries, stuff like that, because they didn't feel like their gifts could be used at the church, and they didn't feel like they could be honest at the church because it would step on people's toes. So that's not all churches, but I definitely get that. Chrissy says, "Hey, all. Saw Jeff was on the live. I'm about 30 minutes behind, but have it on fast mode till I'm caught up." That takes some dedication, Chrissy, but I'm glad that you're here. She also said, "You're so right. Recognize the wolf-like behavior. The first clue is, how is their ego? Are they about materialistic things in life?" Bingo. And you were probably way early in the stream when you said that, Chrissy. But those are both things that we talked about. We talked about ego, and we talked about being materialistic and those sort of things. All of those things we talked about in this stream, and they were talked about in this lawsuit. So again, you called them out. Those are red flags. We shouldn't be surprised when we see those, and you're starting to see that proactively. Well, hey, let's ask these questions because these will tell us a lot. Doesn't mean that person's sinful. Doesn't mean that person's going to fall, but it does, I think, mean it's the likelihood's probably went up. Okay, that we should be paying attention. So spot on with that. Um, the actions that the actions we choose that bring harm on ourselves is, number one, not reading the word for ourselves so that we know what to look for. The Bible warns us over and over and over again about the wolves devouring the sheep. Yeah, Chrissy, I agree. I've said, for years now, biblical illiteracy biblical literacy is the soil where spiritual abuse grows. It grows well in that soil because, man, people can manipulate the Bible, they can twist scripture, they can use it to control you if you don't know scripture. When we know scripture and we hear things that are out of pocket, things that aren't lining up with what Jesus has called the church to be, what Jesus has called leaders to be, we can call that out and say, hey, this isn't Bible. This isn't Christ-like. But if we don't know scripture, we can't call that out. And therefore we let a lot of things go in the name of Jesus that aren't Christ-like at all. She says, Mike Winger is doing excellent work and very much needed. I'm also glad him and Julie Roy's did a podcast together. Me too. I know Mike and Julie have not always completely agreed. I know that that he has challenged her on some things as well. I listened to their podcast together, though. If you hadn't listened to it, I would encourage you to go do that. I thought they had a really good conversation because at the end of the day, while they don't always agree, and while Julie's going to stand her ground, Mike's going to stand his ground, they're willing to challenge one another. They still agree on the most important things, man. Hey, the church has got some work to do. We need to do this. We need to be better. We need to protect people. And I think it's just a good example of we can have uncomfortable conversations. We can challenge one another, and we can still love each other. So, yeah, I think it's huge. My old church, people would just disappear all the time. The congregation never knew exactly why. That, of course, just stirs up gossip mixed in with truth. It hurt people many times. Um, I would I would say, Chrissy, what's even worse to me is the amount of times I've seen it at churches where it's not just people disappearing, it's staff disappearing. And staff disappears and nobody knows why. That was talked about. It's something we didn't get into in the stream, but it's talked about later on in the court docket. I just didn't want to belabor the point, but it's talked about multiple times through there of people just kind of disappearing and that being covered up. Of course, they talk about the $4 million NDA, which we didn't get into, but there's a lot of stuff there. And it's really concerning, and it's wild to me that I went ahead and cut it off because we were, we I think we've already seen the trail of breadcrumbs. We didn't even get to the $4 million allegation of a $4 million NDA, which again, that's what it grows into. But the real question we got to ask is when a church first starts using NDAs or severance agreements for $3,000 severances, if we ask questions there, we never get to the big NDAs and stuff like that. Chrissy doesn't think I'm too hard on Ark. Said Stovall Weems exposing them now. I do have questions about him at the same time because he was in the system for a long time, was removed. I get that tension. I get that tension as well. I have some concerns, some struggles with Stovall. I'll listen to what he says, but I also am not super trustworthy just because the background, but I will listen to it. I will vet it. And I appreciate him having those conversations. But he's also just not like a super trusted voice for me. So Joshua says, hey fam, grace and peace to you all. Watching from Moss Point, Mississippi. I'm glad to catch the live today. Joshua, glad that you are here. Chrissy talks about talent being made a priority. Unfortunately, many churches, it's become about entertainment, and entertainment requires talent. And I think you're hitting the nail on the head there. Entertainment requires talent. And if we need to be entertaining to have people come to our church and to grow our church and to get more tithes, then we start slowly moving to more of an entertainment culture than trying to be, just a true culture of teaching the Bible, of living out Christ-like principles. And when we do that, it's a place where wolves can thrive because wolves are often impressive and talented. And just because a person's impressive and talented doesn't mean that there's someone that you need to be around. Pandora, thanks for watching today. Chrissy says these salaries are disgusting. I agree. Pandora says it would be great to be able to talk to someone about what's going on at my church. Yeah, I don't know what's going on at your church, Pandora, but I can feel the pain through that and the frustration through that comment. Some people will connect over at the Church Disrupted community. A lot of times it's easiest to talk about those things with someone face to face if you know someone in your community. I wish that we were in a place where we had enough volunteers, to where we could always connect somebody with someone else face to face. But while we can't do that, know that I'm just praying for you as you're going through this, because like I said, I don't know what you're going through, but I just kind of, as I read that comment, and I could just sense the frustration there. And if there's something like really serious going on, Vanessa is on the head there. You could send that to Mike Winger, Julie Roy's. We take some stuff, but because of the NDA projects and the other stuff, I'm not able to get to a ton of those stories. So usually Mike's handling a lot. Julie and her team can handle a lot more than the rest of us can. So if it's something that, like you're saying, hey, there's something like a really big deal here, something that needs to be exposed, something that needs to get out there, I'm just reach out to the Roy's report. And if they can't handle it, they could probably point you to someone that could. And if I had the bandwidth, I would love to talk to you about it. I'm struggling to keep up right now with everything that we've got, and I don't want to put you on the back burner. Let me see. Ego stroking is a problem, and people are required to ego stroke. And yeah, it is a problem. When people are required to ego stroke, it becomes more of a problem. So it's like a catch 22. It's like a whole circular thing. Taking offense at correction is a huge clue, because if they're thinking about the honor of Jesus, like you said, then they're not going to do it, right? Um, Pandora says that CREC churches are a hotbed for abuse. Pandora, if you can let me know what the acronym is, I'm not even sure I know what CREC is. I can't speak to that because I don't even know what it is, but I could at least look it up. Um, Chrissy says the NDAs need to go away. That's the first step. I agree. And getting to respond to a large church's response, and I think they responded with good heart and good faith, but being able to respond to kind of their comments and their justifications, I think is helpful as well. Because a lot of times when we get those justifications, they fall apart a bit under scrutiny. Even if nothing else, it really shows why we still have concerns. But a lot of churches have just never thought about it that deeply, because as soon as they give somebody an answer, um, people almost feel like the expectation is just to walk away, so they don't have those conversations deeply. But I agree. Well, there are some places where I could see an NDA, and where we allow for NDAs, I still think the most above board, above reproach way to approach it is simply to say, you know what? It's not worth the risk. If I was leading a church, I would say it's not worth the risk. We're not doing NDAs. But I get that everybody is not going to agree with that. Everybody's not going to have that same take. Chrissy also says integrity in a church would include transparency. I think so. There are a whole lot of Christians that are so used to translucence that transparency feels wrong. But also there are plenty of people who they will rightly say, Jeff, when you guys talk about transparency, that stuff's not outlined completely in Scripture, right? So I get there are places where transparency is good. There are places where maybe translucence is okay. It's just my personal conviction. When in doubt, be transparent. Now, we don't need to be transparent about everything all the time. There are places where that can get inappropriate, but when in doubt, I'm going to lean toward transparency rather than translucence or opaqueness, just because I think it gets us in a better spot. Um, ISS says 2 poles to be aware of: ego stroking and feminism to be aware. Both don't depend solely on Jesus and the Holy Spirit. Um, yeah, I mean, I don't know that I have a lot to add to either one of those specifically, without getting specifics of how it shows up, and it can show up in so many different ways in different places. But I think one thing that you hit on is things that rely on more than Jesus. I think when we start trying to import a lot of other ideals and a lot of other structures, like business structures, for instance, into the church, it's not that everything that we import into the church is bad. I think we have to be careful though, right? Because now, and just to use, because it's a more black and white example for me, when we import business systems and structures like NDAs and severance agreements into the church, well, now we're almost relying on those business structures more than we're relying on Jesus. And then those worldly business structures end up leading us down worldly roads, which leads us to sin, leads us to destruction. And we act like, we act super surprised that it happens. So, and Chrissy says, yep, I was talking about staff disappearing. So you have experienced it as well. And then Pandora says CRC is the Communion of Reformed Evangelical Churches, aka Doug Wilson influenced churches. Okay, awesome. You're welcome. I hope that the awareness and the work that we do is helpful to you and helpful to others. But I'll check that out. There's still a lot doing this work. I learn about like segments of Christianity that I knew nothing about when I started this work. So there's always groups to look into, and not just to look into to teach about or expose something here or there, but also just to begin to reach out. And sometimes the churches I'm most frustrated with, I'm going to reach out and invite them to take the Safe Church Pledge. Literally, it's on my to-do list right now to reach out to the church where I experienced the deepest trauma and where I experienced spiritual abuse. It's on my list to reach out to them, to offer the olive branch and say, this isn't about me. If you would be willing to take the steps for the Safe Church Pledge and you'd be willing to fight for safety, then I'm willing to work with you, and I'm willing to support you, and I'm willing to celebrate you, because it's not about being right. It's not about just pursuing justice blindly or anything like that. Like I want to see safe churches. So it's fun. Sometimes as I learn things where people say, "Man, these churches are having a lot of struggles," it can open up conversations to where, if nothing else, we can pull back the curtain and say, "Hey, is there anybody over here in the circle that maybe wants to pursue a different way?" So anyway, let's go ahead. We won't get to a ton of other stuff. We're not going to get to all of everything that I want to talk about today in depth, but I want to talk about a couple of other things. So let's go ahead and let's jump back into it. But when I say success leads clues, or when I say that sin leaves clues, I'm not just talking about this one instance. I'm not just talking about the situation with Greg Laurie. We can see it in multiple instances. So I'm going to show you some other instances of why repeatedly we keep seeing things happen, and we keep seeing, what appears like wolf-like behavior and wolves in the sheep pen hurting people in the church. Why do we keep having these scandals? Why do we keep having these sin? Well, I'm going to show you multiple examples of why I think these things keep happening, and it's because we don't respond well. Okay, so two things. One, when we see sin in the church, often we don't respond well to that sin. We're not willing to have tough conversations. We're not willing to hold people accountable. We're not willing to say oftentimes, "Hey, Jesus still loves you, and we can restore you as a brother or sister in Christ," but we're not restoring you to ministry, right? So I think that's part of it. But the second thing is not just that we don't respond to the sin well, we don't learn from the sin well. So I want to look at a couple of other instances, just things that have been going on recently. And I want to see some more lessons that we can learn from this. I want to see, are there breadcrumbs that we can pick up that are littered on the path to sin? Can we see why we keep repeating these same scandals and stuff in the church? And I think one place that we can start is there are two kind of big names, two well recognized names that are back in the church news right now. And the first one's Mark Driscoll. I'm going to show you a couple of headlines. I'm not going to read these headlines. These are on julieroys.com on the Roys Report. You can read them on your own. But this one may seem innocuous right off the bat, but it says Mark Driscoll's booming Trinity Church pays $15.5 million for a vacant office complex. Now, I don't care where they're meeting. I don't care that they bought a building. $15.5 million seems like a lot, but I also know when you're talking about big real estate, commercial real estate, that's expensive. That is not my problem. Okay. But when I saw this headline, this is why it brought up this thread to me of sin leaves clues. And is it possible that we're choosing we're actually making choices that are leading us to more scandals? Well, when I saw this, every time I see Mark Driscoll pop up like this, all I can think of, kind of my first thought is, why is this guy still in ministry? It's not because I don't like Mark. It's not because I have a vendetta against Mark. I don't know Mark, but it's because there's enough evidence from the things that happened at Mars Hill. The fact that he still has, I think, 21 elders who have said he's not fit to return to ministry. If you just listen to the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast and just the evidence that's there, there's no biblical reason where I can justify Mark being back in ministry. And then when Mark was restored to ministry, he was restored by people like Robert Morris and Jimmy Evans, who have since had scandals of their own, including Robert Morris being in prison right now. So these are the people that chose to restore him to ministry, right? But not only did I ask the question, why is Mark Driscoll still in ministry? I look at this, and this headline tells me not only is he still in ministry, his ministry is growing. Why is it growing? And I think we can go back to breadcrumbs that we saw and lessons that we learned in the Greg Laurie court documents, okay? Because we can go back and we can say, why is Mark Driscoll's church growing? Why is attendance booming so much that they need to buy a $15.5 million vacant office complex and start a building campaign? Well, it's because Mark Driscoll, I believe, is talented, right? And you may not like Mark Driscoll. You may have a lot stronger opinions of Mark Driscoll than me. I don't know Mark Driscoll. I think he's disqualified from ministry. I think he's dangerous to people in the church. So that's it. But I'm not emotional about it. I just don't think the guy should be in ministry. But I understand why his church is growing. I understand why people keep coming back to it, because especially, man, even go back to Mars Hill, you would have young men who would come in and they would hear a message that drew them. And Mark has always been a talented speaker. He has a way of connecting with groups of people that maybe others wouldn't. And Mark has been, since kind of the beginning, talented on social media. Mark shows up on my social media all the time, and there is nobody I can swipe faster through because I want to train the algorithm. I don't want to hear from Mark. Yeah, every few months, Mark is back on my feed. Why? Because social media knows he's good at social media. So you got this talented guy, and he has a product. His speaking, his teaching on the Bible, his teaching on politics, because a lot of that's mixed together. He's doing work with Turning Point USA now. So he's saying things that people like. He is talented. And because of that, people are willing to overlook his past. There's a lot of Christians who say, well, man, I like the things he says about politics. So I'm not worried about that stuff with Mars Hill. Or I like the stuff that he does with Turning Point. So I'm going to listen to that. Or I like this sermon that I heard. Right. And I've had some uncomfortable conversations about this. Okay. I remember it was either a year or 2 years ago. We're sitting with some family at a July 4th cookout. And all of a sudden, I have somebody in my family that's like, hey, have you heard this sermon by this guy named Mark Driscoll? Let me send it to you. It's awesome. You'll love it. And I'm like, no, I won't love it. Did you know he's actually disqualified from ministry? I told them the whole history and they didn't even know, because they know Mark Driscoll is someone who shows up on my social media feed, who's talented, who says things that I like to hear. Even if they're uncomfortable, they're things I want to hear. They're tickling my ears in a way. Okay. So Mark is talented. Mark is back in ministry. They're buying this church, right? But again, if we can't learn from Mark's behavior in the past, not just at Mars Hill, but when people have come out and said he's still got bullying leadership at Trinity. And there have been reports of, like, I think potentially NDAs being used, people reporting being surveilled, being controlled. There have been reports of Mark still having unchecked power. Nobody knows what his accountability structure looks like. So all the same red flags are still there. He never took care of the problems at Mars Hill. So if another scandal happens with Mark, and I hope it doesn't, but my bet is it probably does. And if a scandal happens with Mark or with Trinity, people are going to be shocked. But should we be shocked? No, because he's already shown us who he is. He has a track record of doing these same things. So why is he successful? How are we choosing scandal and sin in the church? By restoring and platforming people who make us feel good and are talented, even when their character doesn't align with what the Bible says it should align with. But it's not just Mark. All right, Brady Boyd from New Life Church, Colorado Springs. It's not even been a year since he was removed because emails and stuff were released in court documents that showed he should have known. By all accounts, he should have known that Robert Morris had SA'd a child, Cindy Clemishear, when she was like 13 years old. Okay, so he's removed. It hasn't even been a year, and guess what? Brady Boyd is starting a new church. And not just as Brady Boyd starting a new church. Get this. Brady Boyd is starting a new church down the street, basically right near the church that just fired him. Okay. Because why? Well, I'm called to ministry, and that calling has only grown stronger. Now, if he's doing this, why is he doing it? He's doing it because people have expressed an interest in coming to his church. He's doing it because people want to support him. He's doing it because he believes people will attend. Why will they do that? Well, because there's people who really like what Brady Boyd has to say. There's people who want him to be okay. So again, we're choosing talent. We're choosing comfort over doing what is right, over saying, no, we're going to hold people accountable for sin. He's shown me in the past what he's doing. Now, you think about it. We talked about restoration of pastors time in and time again. You don't always have to be restored, okay? You don't have to have somebody restore you like Brady Boyd, although there are other people in kind of the same circle that Mark Driscoll is running in. Some of those same names come up here that have tried to restore him. But even if nobody restored Mark Driscoll, even if nobody restored Brady Boyd, you can still jump back into ministry as long as there are people who are willing to listen to you. Reminds me of Tabner Smith and Venue in Chattanooga in North Georgia with Venue Church. Basically imploded his church because of his own sin, changed the name, and is still doing ministry because he's a good teacher. People enjoy it. He's talented, so they're going to come and they're going to listen to him. And a lot of them don't even know the story, don't know that he's disqualified. But that's not the only one. Let's look at another one. All right. North Carolina church to pursue investigation of Acts 29 VP fired for sexual misconduct. Tyler Jones, the founding pastor of Vintage Church in North Carolina, he was removed in the last couple of weeks, not only from his church as a pastor, but from Acts 29. Now, you may be saying, Jeff, Acts 29, That sounds familiar. What is Acts 29? Why does it sound familiar? Well, if you can't place it, Acts 29 is a church planting network. It's a church network. It's similar in a lot of ways from my perspective to ARC, the Association of Related Churches. And I'm not against all church planting networks, but I've got a bad taste in my mouth from church planting networks because I've seen the scandal that surrounds them, because I've seen the systems. Okay. But here's another reason why Acts 29 may be ringing bells for you right now, because good old Mark Driscoll was one of the co-founders of Acts 29. And not only was he removed from Mars Hill decades ago because of his sin, because of bullying leadership, domineering leadership, just generally biblically not being qualified to be an elder, but he was also removed from Acts 29. But that's not all, okay? I can't even remember the guy's name. I think it was Timus or whatever. They had another leader who had been kind of their CEO for years who was removed around like 2020, 21, 22. Matt Chandler ended up not being removed, but he did have to step down from the Village Church. He wasn't having a sexual relationship, but he was having a relationship that was inappropriate enough, conversations inappropriate enough with a woman he wasn't married to, that he stepped down. And even though he's back in ministry now, he's been a longtime leader at Acts 29. Okay. They've had multiple leaders. I think it's like 4 or 5 leaders now that have been removed in different ways. And it makes you wonder, okay, again, are we learning from these breadcrumbs? Sin leaves clues. Are we learning from these breadcrumbs, or are we just continually being surprised by the same things? Because what I would look at with Acts 29 is I would say there might be something after everything that's happened. There might just be something that you're looking for in your leaders, that you prize in your leaders, right? It probably has something to do with charisma and being able to challenge and speak well. But there's something that from your very inception you have prized in your leaders that also tends to be in a whole lot of leaders who fall. Acts 29 is not that old of an organization. I think they've had more moral failures at the high levels of leadership than any organization that I can remember. Yet we continue being surprised by it. What I would say, and just because a church is an Acts 29 church doesn't mean they're a bad church, but I would say if you're a church and you're a part of Acts 29, I don't know that you should be, if you're very involved in Acts 29, I don't know that it makes sense to be surprised if there's sin, if there's scandal, if something breaks, bad news breaks and your church is a part of it, because it seems like there's something systemic here that is leading us down paths to call for talented people whose character may not be able to hold up the weight. And if I was a part of Acts 29, I would encourage the current leaders, you got to do some soul searching and figure out what that is. Because there's something in the water, there's something systemic. There are breadcrumbs that if you will look for them, we can avoid this continuing to happen again. So you got fallen Mark Driscoll helps found Acts 29, removed from Acts 29, removed from Mars Hill, starts Trinity. Now it's growing so much they got the building project. You got Brady Boyd, who in the last year was removed from New Life in Colorado Springs because it would seem that he actively covered up and covered for Robert Morris all those years when he should have known. He's starting a church down the street. You got Tyler Jones, who was removed from Acts 29 and from his church in North Carolina because he's had a long time affair. And then you've got, again, March 1st, it's just in the last couple of weeks, Crossroads Church, which is a big church in like Cincinnati. So it's in that Ohio and Northern Kentucky area. Crossroads Church investigating Pastor Brian Tome over 2015 quote unquote humor. And let's just talk about this for a little bit. You may not have heard about this. I don't want to go super deep into it, but this is the guy, huge church. This is also, by the way, again, should we be surprised? Sin and scandal tend to follow breadcrumbs that we've seen. Crossroads may sound familiar to you because Crossroads has made the news in a lot of different ways. But Crossroads was a couple of years ago the church that had the Super Bowl weekend service. I think that they still do, but they were the ones who had the kind of wild halftime show and ended up kicking a Bible off of a tee and everything else like that. So again, that when that was going on, people who talked about that, I remember talking about that and some people saying, Jeff, you're just being too hard. You're just being too hard. They were just doing something fun on stage. It was a Bible cover. It wasn't a Bible. Some of you guys are making, mountains out of molehills. Why is it not surprising that there's greater scandal now, that now there's an independent investigation? I'll give them credit They placed him on leave. They're doing an independent investigation. And Pastor Brian has said, I welcome the independent investigation. We got to learn from this. The truth needs to come out. Okay. So again, I'll give them props for that. But it doesn't surprise me when a church has already done some questionable things that could cause some believers to stumble. It doesn't surprise me when they do something else, because again, it's a slippery slope. If I justify and excuse and do all that stuff, and I'm constantly just sliding on why things are okay over here, eventually it's going to show up over here. But with Pastor Brian, pastor of the sixth largest megachurch in America. I mean, this is, guys, this is the sixth largest in the United States, has been suspended over allegations of inappropriate physical humor. Okay. He's been relieved of all responsibilities until an independent investigation is complete. The email included no details about the alleged incident, but board chairman Brian Wells offered more information March 1st in church services. He said that, and guys, this is in black and white. You can go back on when you watch the video, but this is weird. He said that Tome allegedly rubbed a man's crotch with a riding crop, like the thing that you use with horses, and said, "Oh yeah, do you like that?" And he's saying that this is joke, right? But it's come up, when they were talking about other things. Why did this come up? Okay. The church investigated the same incident internally a couple of years ago in 2024 and basically moved on. They considered the issue resolved, as many boards do. Okay. But the man raised the issue at Crossroads again after the mega church fired youth minister who was caught secretly filming women at the gym. That story's not very old. That story's happened recently. You can find it on the Roy's Report as well. You got this youth minister who was fired from Crossroads for secretly filming women at the gym. And even though it wasn't related to this, you have this whole situation right here, like this whole statement that Pastor Brian Tome writes about, hey, we need to hold high standards. We need to make sure that people are safe, all those sort of things. Well, that brings the person who alleged this incident in 2024 to come back around and go, hey, you're not eating, you're cooking. You're saying good things now that this other thing has happened and the youth pastor's, been caught and been fired and been arrested and all of that because he's, caught secretly filming girls in the gym. And now you're saying all this stuff, but that's not how the church acted when I brought these allegations before, right? You talked about providing a healthy environment where our staff and community can grow in their faith and feel safe is incredibly important. We also want to be transparent when problems arise. Great stuff. But the man who complained in 2024 did not feel the church prioritized a healthy environment for him. He did not feel the process that handled his concerns were fair or objective. So he contacted church leadership again. And when they looked at it the second time, they decided to ask a third party to investigate. But again, guys, and I'm not saying that he's guilty, but should we be surprised that Brian Tome is on leave and the sixth largest megachurch in the country is facing this scandal when they were kicking Bibles off the stage a couple of years ago and then basically just making fun of anybody who challenged them about that? They wouldn't receive reproach. They just wanted to push back and villainize anybody who pushed back on them. Okay. They wanted to go on the defensive attack, it seemed like to me. So you got that happening, and then that stuff happens. We don't deal with it. And then you got in 2024 this incident. You don't deal with it. You kind of shake it under the rug. And then all of a sudden you got a youth pastor who is secretly filming women at the gym. I'm not saying any of those caused one another, but what I am saying is it's a slippery slope. If you're not dealing with sin and you're not dealing with questionable behavior early on, and you're not willing to receive accountability when you don't fully agree with people, you're not willing to say, you know what, even though maybe I don't agree with you and I think you're being too hard on that, the job is to be above reproach. The job is to really walk in integrity, to go the extra mile, to when in doubt, choose transparency over translucence, right? So should we be surprised that this is happening? And I don't think so, because I think what we have shown is there's not been transparency in the past. There has been a lot of defensiveness, a lot of posturing. They've been able to get by with this stuff. And now what it looks like to me, I'm just going to be honest, it looks like a culture where gray, ambiguous, potentially morally questionable things are allowed to happen as long as they don't come out publicly. Now, I could be wrong, but that's what it looks like to me. Then you have Bethel. Bethel's been through their own controversy with everything else. They've talked about creating their own safe church program, which is nothing to do with our safe church program and is, in my opinion, not very safe. But they've been completely embattled. And then at the end of February, just again in the last 10 days or so, they decided it was a good idea after everything they've been through to shut down their alumni Facebook page. And they went through it and they talked about why they did it. And they basically just said the whole reason why we did this is not to, it's not to shut you up, it's not to control you or anything like that. But we want to make sure that we can weigh every concern, right? We recognize that we want people to feel heard, but this isn't a space where we can properly review, investigate. So they basically use their desire to investigate things to say, you guys can't talk here. And of course, they received a ton of backlash. The people who are already a part of that group made a new group because they're not going to stop talking about it. But again, Bethel has been through so many issues. We're going back over the last 10 years. There's been concern after concern after concern that has cropped up. And then finally it gets public traction with this fake prophecy thing and cover up. Why should we be surprised that now they're deleting a Facebook page, right? Because even if they're trying to get better and they're trying to be more transparent, they're trying to be a safe church, you got the same people who created an unsafe environment that are now the ones who are saying, well, we created a plan and put a lot of time in it to make the church safe, and this is what we're doing. Okay, well, you can't have the same people who created the unsafe environment to create the safe environment. That's not what's going to happen. Okay, but again, I talked about it a few weeks ago. Chris Valentin, Bill Johnson, all the same kind of leadership team people, the same people are still running the ship. The same people are still steering it. Why should we expect anything different? Nobody's taking leave of absence. Nobody's really, they're accepting we did some things wrong, but they're not accepting accountability and oversight for other people. So should we be surprised? Just again, whether it's Greg Laurie, whether it's Mark Driscoll, Brady Boyd returning to ministry, Tyler Jones, I always forget Tyler's name, at X29, another fallen leader at X29, whether it's Brian Tome, whether it's Bethel leadership, should we be surprised? And I would say, no, I don't think we should be surprised. And guys, it's not just because they've had issues in the past, but it's again, sin leaves clues. We know what some of the breadcrumbs look like that we often find on the slippery slope to scandal. And if you haven't checked it out, again, it's free. We don't get anything from it. But we did a small applied research study last year where we looked and we found, hey, and I know correlation doesn't always equal causation, but there is a high correlation of low safe church provisions, low safe church actions in churches that have scandal. You're looking at most churches that end up facing public scandal, they have less than one of the safe church pledge challenges, the best practices in place. And it's for, there's a reason why that is, because instead of transparency, which is what we try to ask churches to do with Safe Church Pledge, there's a mixture of translucence and opaqueness to control. Okay. And when you're not being open and honest about some of the things, like, let's just go ahead and let me pull it back up and we'll look at it together here. If you go to the Spiritual Abuse Institute, spiritualabuse.institute, and you go to take the Safe Church Pledge there, you'll pull it up. We actually talk about all of this stuff. We break everything into 3 categories. What are safe churches? Safe churches are transparent, they're accountable, and they're protective. And I believe we can show you that in the data. So we got 16 commitments that fit into those buckets, fit into those pillars: transparent, accountable, and protective. If you haven't listened to the episode of the podcast I did with Natalie Runyon talking about this, it was a great podcast where we really dove into the nitty gritty of this. So she's, of course, on this page asking me questions, me answering those questions in quite a bit. But guys, look just at transparency. The first thing we start with is financial transparency. Can you give an annual report that's more than a pie chart? Because again, it doesn't mean that you're sinful if you can't. But when we find churches that have scandal, we almost always find churches with a whole lot of money who don't want to tell anybody what's going on with the money. Well, let's just look at some of these churches, right? Let's look at Bethel. Let's look at all of their stuff. Let's look at Give. Let's just hit the Give page. Is there any sort of annual report that we can find easily that actually tells us where the money's being spent, that goes into any sort of detail? I don't see it. So let's go ahead. Let's look under more. Let's look at the bottom. I don't see anything. Okay. The same thing. Let's go to Crossroads here. Crossroads, Brian Tomes Church. Let's go ahead and see with the menu. Is there anything going on there? Nope. Doesn't look like anything in the menu that we'd see. So let's go down to the bottom. Let's see if we can find an annual report of any sort of thing. Okay. So you got about giving. Ah, look, annual report. So maybe this is good. Maybe this is good. Is it more than a pie chart? Is it more than a pie chart? Does it actually give any sort of transparency? Nope. And again, I'm not against pie charts. We have a pie chart and we're small. We're a really small organization. So our like accounts are small. We have less than like 20 line items in general. But I tell churches, if you ever worked at a church or you've been around a church that has presented this, every church has or most every church of any size, they're going to have a software where they have funds set up for everything. So like there's a missions budget. There's a youth ministry budget. There's a kids ministry budget. There's a worship budget. There's a maintenance budget. There's all those sort of things. So whatever kind of funds you have, and there are churches that have 200-300 funds, right? The main funds that you have, not every sub account, but those main departments and ministry departments, show how that money's being spent, right? Don't call everything ministry. At least be able to say how much is even in just a big bucket of salaries, right? That's not on a lot of these, right? When you look at this pie chart, we got principal and interest. We got off the grid. What does that mean? 3.21% on marketing and design. Okay, I kind of get that. 7.3% on reach out. I don't really know what that means. Probably missions. IT is 14.2%. Content. Central operations. What does central operations mean? Ministry through community. What does that mean? What I will tell you is that salaries aren't on here. And I will tell you that salaries are normally more than 40%, sometimes more than 50% of a church's budget. So I wonder if ministry through the community is counted as, if salaries are counted partially in that, partially in central operations, partially in these others. I don't know. But do we see any more detail? No, we don't. Okay. The same thing, I bet, if we looked at Vintage Church. I'm guessing it's going to be the same kind of thing. Okay. And again, we could just go through all of these. We could go through this with Trinity, right? I'm going to encourage you to do this because I don't want to spend tons and tons of time on the show going through this with you. But go look at it with Trinity. Do they have a good annual report? I'm just guessing that they don't. What about Harvest Church with Greg Laurie? Let's just go ahead, since this is the one that we started with today that we talked about for so long. If you haven't checked that out, you need to go back and check that out. But let's just see. Do they have anything? I don't see anything at the bottom about an annual report. I don't see, well, my bad, looking at the wrong thing. I don't see anything really at the top. So let's just go to give and see if it's on the give page, because sometimes it is. Is there anything on the give page for an annual report or how they use the money? Nope. So again, that's one of those red flags that it shouldn't surprise us when we see churches missing major parts of these buckets if they end up facing scandal, because that's something that's correlated with a lot of churches that are facing scandal, right? So that's what we've seen. That's just the first one, financial transparency. Okay. Let me disclosure of affiliations and partnerships. Go back and look at it. My guess is none of those churches actually have a list of these are the people that are our partnerships. And what I mean is we pay dues to be a part of this. We're official members of this. Like, with Harvest Bible Chapel, it would be, at least from what we've seen from the legal filings, being a part of Calvary Chapel, being a part of Southern Baptist Convention. Are you a part of things like ARC? Like, what are these organizations that you are trading money with, that you're paying for membership, all that sort of stuff? I bet you're not going to find any of them. Okay. Nepotism protection policy. You don't have to necessarily have that blinking on your front page, but go look at these different churches and see, is there any sign of nepotism? And if there is, or any questions about nepotism, do they actually have any information about that whatsoever? So let's go ahead and let's just look, see if we can find anything on Bethel here real quick. Let's go to leadership. And let's just see, because a lot of times if you look at their leadership and their staff, you can see if there's any signs of nepotism. We don't have to go very far. There's questions. I'm not saying there is nepotism, but there's questions. And if there's questions, you should answer those questions proactively. That's what we're teaching in the Safe Church Pledge with a nepotism protection policy. Let people know, do we have family on staff? If we have family on staff, what are the things that we do to make sure that we're protecting against nepotism? We're protecting against impropriety. Let's look at Bethel. Right there, you have Chris Valentin and Kathy Valentin. They're both senior associate leaders. Just right there, you have Brian and Jen Johnson. Okay, you can't have two couples working together and somebody working for somebody else. And are they really going to disagree with each other? There's all kinds of issues that comes up with that. You see Ben and Heather Armstrong. Okay, and it says they're both on leave. But when it says they're on leave, it doesn't tell you, if you're not aware with this, that they're on leave because of allegations of sin and moral impropriety. Okay, it looks like you got two Crandalls there. Okay, there's two Gordons there. Maybe they're, related. I really don't know. You've got two more Valentins there. Okay. So again, we don't have to look very far to find questions about nepotism, but we don't find answers about nepotism, which is what we would tell a Safe Church Pledge church. Let's go ahead and put those answers out there. Let's go ahead and decide that stuff in advance. And for many churches, they're going to decide it's probably the best way to be above reproach is just not to hire family members, right? But we'll at least have a policy if we decide to change that. Okay. Crossroads Church. I don't really know where they would be at with that. Let me see if there's any of these that I can think of right off the bat. If there's anything we can see with New Life. Okay. And I don't know if we'll be able to see anything right off the bat, but you could just look through and see, are there similar last names? Because that can be where these questions show up. Now, also, if you look at Spiritual Abuse Institute, because I think that's important to show you, are we putting our money where our mouth is? Are we eating our own cooking? So if you go to our leadership, we've actually got two people with the same last name. Mike Grimes is our president, but we also have a board member, Matt Grimes. Okay. And when you see Matt, do you see what it says right there? Because we're not perfect, but we're trying to do what we're asking churches to do because we know the slippery slope. We want you to know, because we don't allow in our bylaws. Okay. If you actually look at our bylaws at the bottom of this page, and if you've never seen that, our bylaws are here. Our bylaws don't allow us to have people in leadership who are related in any sort of way. But we say Matt Grimes has no relation to Mike because we want you to know that. We know people could look at that. That would raise a nepotism question. Okay, so we have a nepotism protection policy. We have it even in our bylaws that people can look at right there on the website because we want people to know. But not only that, we want them to know these people have the same last name. They live in the same city. They're not related in any way. They didn't know each other until we started this work together, okay? Because we think that is important. All right, so let's just go down to accountability. Let's look at a couple of things. Governance structure. Do we know how you're governed? Do we know how you're led? Who's the legal governance? And do we know who the governing body is? And is the governing body independent? Are there bylaws? We can look at all four of those, okay? Because usually you can have a decent idea of whether the governing body is independent, especially if they're transparent. But it's pretty easy to say, is there a governance structure on this church's website? Do we know who the governing body is? And do they have bylaws listed on their website? Okay, so let's go to Bethel. Let's go ahead and go to leadership, because that's usually where you're going to find not only the staff, but where they will share any sort of governance structure that they have. That's the most common place. Well, we know who they are. Okay, the senior leadership team. But we don't know if the senior leadership team is actually, we don't know if that's the legal governing body. Okay, because it may not be. This may be a group of people who, let me go back to Bethel, this may be a group of people who share like decision making and stuff, but at the end of the day, there's only one person who could legally make decisions. That's how a lot of ARC churches look, right? So in an ARC church, if they're telling you about their governance, this isn't all ARC churches, but in many of them, they would say our trustees are going to oversee the finances. Our overseers are who will hold the pastor accountable in any sort of moral failure dealing, and our elders hold the pastor accountable in day-to-day spiritual stuff. But what you find out is if you actually look deeper, the only people who could remove the senior pastor are the overseers, and that's only if the trustees and the elders agree and call them in. Okay, so again, do we know the governance structure? We don't. We know that there is a senior leadership team, but we don't know if that's the actual legal governance structure. Again, if we go back to ours, the Spiritual Abuse Institute is led by a board of directors that oversees the organization and ensures SAI and its volunteers stay on mission. It has to consist of 3 to 7 voting members at all times. They hold the executive director accountable to the mission, the bylaws, and the policies of SAI. If you go to the bylaws, you see very clearly this board, they are the legal governance structure of SAI. And you see, I am not a voting member. I go to the meetings. I tell them what's going on day to day. I tell them what my thoughts were when I originally, created this thing, but I answer to them. Okay. And so that's what that is. We don't know if there's anything with Bethel. Okay. But we do know if this is their legal governance, who it is, but I don't know that I could give them a point on either one of those because I don't know if that's their legal governing body. Okay. It definitely doesn't look independent because all of those people look like they work at the church. Okay. Let's just be real. You can't be independent if you're taking a paycheck. And if I'm not mistaken, Danny Silk has gotten paid. I don't think he's on staff, but he's gotten paid to speak and everything else. If I'm not mistaken, Bill Johnson, senior pastor, Chris Valentin's on staff. Brian and Jen Johnson are on staff. And Heather Armstrong are on staff. So they can't be truly independent as a board, but let's go ahead and look. Bylaws are almost always going to be at the bottom because bylaws is not something you're putting in your menu for visitors. But are there bylaws? They would almost always be over here. There are no bylaws. Now, again, if you come to Spiritual Abuse Institute website, our bylaws are right there. And you can click on them at the bottom and you can actually see our bylaws, everything that's supposed to happen legally, because we're not hiding that because there's really no reason to hide that. Okay, so let's look at Crossroads real quick. Do we see bylaws on the back or on the bottom? Let me know if you see it in the chat because I don't see any bylaws. So let's look at leadership. What does their leadership look like? Okay, got a timeline. Hills they die on, what they believe. Here's leadership. Okay, Brian's senior pastor. Kyle Ranson is lead pastor. You got your executive pastor. Okay, all these people are pastors. So that's not a governing board. That's not a governance structure. They're not detailing any sort of governance structure. This is a staff page. Okay, let me see. Do they answer any questions about governance under the FAQ? It does not. Okay, so there's nothing there. Okay, so again, we have a whole nother church that we're dealing with here. No governance structure, no governing body, no bylaws. All right, so let's look at Trinity with Mark Driscoll. Okay, let's go ahead. See if there's anything up here about us. Sometimes we'll have leadership. This just says Pastor Mark Driscoll and Grace. Here's a leadership team. Okay. But those are pastors, so that's just staff. They're calling it a leadership team, but that's just high-level staff. Now they're giving you all the staff, giving you their values. Okay, frequently asked questions. Let's see. There's nothing about governance structure. Yeah, so there's 0 about governance structure. Looks like nothing on, there's no governance structure. There's no governing body. Are there bylaws? There's no bylaws. Now let's look at giving because we didn't look for them a minute ago. Is there an annual report under giving? I didn't see it anywhere else. So let's just look. There's no annual report. Okay. So again, I say all this for a reason. Should we be surprised when you start looking at each of these churches that have either faced scandal or their pastors have faced previous scandal and they're back in ministry? What we're looking at is just transparency and accountability, the things that we could see publicly, the things that breed transparency, the things that actually stop those breadcrumbs that lead down the path of sin so often in scandal-ridden churches, right? Those things, they're not doing the things required that we see are required to actually avoid those things. So should we be surprised? And I'll go back to it here. Should we be surprised if the stuff with Greg Laurie, if even 25% of it turns out to be true and he ends up disqualified from ministry? I hate that I'm saying no, but based on what is in that lawsuit, it wouldn't be surprising for me. I hope it's not true, but it wouldn't be surprising if those behaviors are true. It wouldn't be surprising that it led to something more. If Mark Driscoll and their new Trinity in their new building, he ends up having another scandal, would that be surprising? I don't think so because I don't see him doing anything different. He never dealt with the issues. What if Brady Boyd has another scandal at his new church? Would that be surprising? Again, it wouldn't be to me because he's following the same breadcrumbs, it would seem. They're not fixing the things that lead down the slippery slope to sin. And because, again, people love Greg Laurie and his teaching, he's talented. And they love Mark Driscoll because he's talented. And they love Brady Boyd and his teaching because they're talented. And they love Brian Tome because he's talented. And they love these guys. They love all the leaders at Bethel because they're talented. Because we're doing that, are we choosing to let scandal be a thing that happens in churches? Are we choosing to let sin live and let sin grow? Are we choosing to open the door in the sheep pen for wolves? Are we inviting them in because they're just so dang talented? That's my fear. That's my fear. Maybe you disagree with me. Let me know in the comments. Let me know in the chat. But that is my fear. And I think it's a legitimate fear. So I wanted to look at these stories today because I wanted us to look at the thread and I wanted to just challenge you. I don't think we should be surprised when we see sin arise because we know the things that are leading to sin and scandal in churches. We know the things that the soil, if you will, that allows it to grow. And if we're not holding our churches accountable to at least disrupt that soil, will the Safe Church Pledge fix all this? I don't know, but I know if a church is doing the things the Safe Church Pledge asks, even at a minimum level, right? I know that they're going to be doing things that most churches that face scandal have never done, right? We got to at least try something different though, because if we're doing the same things, we can't be surprised when we get the same results. And if we're not willing to have hard conversations, we're not willing to hold leaders accountable. If we are not willing to just get back here, if we are not willing to say, you sinned, you failed, you missed the requirement, sit down and stay seated. If we're not willing to do that with people like Mark Driscoll and Brady Boyd, then how can we be surprised if they hurt other people in the future? So what is the best way, if you're asking this question, and I hope you're asking this question, what's the best way that we can fight against sin in the church? What's the best way that we can protect the sheep? What's the best way that we can foster a trustworthy church that has a good reputation that people can believe in? What's the best way that we can avoid scandals and news stories and trauma and all of the things? I think the best way that we can do that is simply to, so we talked about Greg Laurie earlier. If something doesn't sit right with your spirit, ask questions. Even if they're uncomfortable, ask them in good faith and trust the spirit of truth in you. So that would be the first thing. And the second thing is when there aren't good answers, guys, keep asking questions and be willing to hold somebody accountable. And sometimes you may say, Jeff, I'm not in leadership in my church. There's nothing I can do. I'm not a big enough giver to put pressure on them and stuff like that. And I get it. But if you're at a church and they can't answer these questions well, the answers they're giving, you feel convicted in your spirit. Sometimes the only thing that we can do to hold them accountable is simply say, well, I can't support this. I know it's not enough me alone, but if other people feel this way and they're being convicted in their spirit, then if enough of us said, well, we just can't support this until you change, well, when enough dollars go away, enough donations go away, enough attendance goes away, that will usually force change. And I hate to say that because it's not like I'm not telling you if you don't get your way, leave, stop giving, take people with you. That is not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is be willing to ask the questions. And if you can't get answers that help you resolve and feel good in your spirit about what's going on, that may be a good indication that God is calling you somewhere else. And sometimes the best way that we can contend for a healthy church, as bad as it sounds, is to leave an unhealthy one, to stop supporting an unhealthy one. And look, I've got some churches filled with people I love. I can't go and I can't support them because there's too many red flags for me. And the best way I can contend, even with the podcast, even as a part of SAI and the original founder of SAI and all the work that we do, still sometimes the best way that I can contend for a healthy church in my city is to simply not support the ones that look unhealthy, the ones where I get a check in my spirit. But just because we like the way somebody teaches, that doesn't mean that listening to their podcast is good if they're disqualified, or going to their church is good if they're disqualified, or reading their books is good if they're disqualified. We got to hold people accountable and believe the person can be restored without the title, without the authority. But anyway, guys, let me know what you're thinking. Let me know any questions that have popped up for you. But I hope this has helped you to think differently, because for me, I'm not surprised when these things happen anymore. What surprises me, what shocks me, is that we're not noticing the patterns. Because in all of these scenarios, I believe if these leaders were held accountable earlier over smaller things, we could have protected them. We could have protected the sheep. We could have protected the church, and we could have protected the reputation of these churches and their communities. Everybody gets better when we're willing to have uncomfortable conversations in love, and everybody gets better when we practice true loving accountability. So anyway, again, I hope this has helped you think differently. Let me know how it's helped you think differently. That's it for this one, but we'll be back with another one soon. Until then, grace and peace. I'm praying for you, and I'm praying for the Holy Spirit to show you something new this week as you ask these questions. All right, guys, that's it for the stream today. But I'll go ahead and we'll just see if there's anything new in the chat that we can talk about. Let me see. Chrissy says, I just read that Mark Driscoll story. These people obviously don't know about Mars Hill. And that's true, Chrissy. A lot of people don't. And they don't look it up, and they don't ask questions. And they get mad when people say something different, because it's comfortable for them to be at the church. So when they find out later, it's hard. That family member, I was talking about, they really seemed at odds that day when I told them, about Mark's history. And it's like, hey, that really seemed to bother them. But also I could tell, man, I really like his messages. Am I really going to stop listening to him because he did this thing? And people struggle with that tension. They really, really do. I agree with you. You said he's verbally abusive, in my opinion. I think there's a lot of what I would consider abusive behavior. But again, that's just my opinion. Not everybody's going to agree, but I think there's enough documented behavior. Enough people have called it abusive, including his elders, that biblically we should be able to support it, even if we don't fully agree with it. Pandora says churches have become so political that the gospel and the love of Christ for people are taking a back seat. Even the Bible is interpreted through a political lens. I 100% agree with that, Pandora, and I've seen it on both sides. I've seen churches that are so political, on the right side that happens. I've seen churches that are so political on the left side through a blue lens that happens. And the one thing that I know, because I don't like getting into politics, because there's always something we're going to disagree with. But the one thing that I always feel like I can say plainly is, whatever your political side is, whatever your political mascot is, whether that's Republican, Democrat, the donkey, the elephant, the porcupine for libertarians, whatever it is, whatever your political team and mascot is, Jesus isn't probably on that political team, and he doesn't want to be your political mascot. So that's the one thing that I can say. No matter what party you are a part of or ideology you believe in, following Christ is going to challenge that in a good way. So hopefully that doesn't bother anybody, but if it does, you need to ask why it bothers you. So Chrissy says, I've seen that too. It's sad when it happens to some of these little guy churches that join large church plant organizations. That's again why it's important to know your affiliations. There are times where we talk about different affiliations, like when we talked about a couple of smaller church planting networks, whether it was the WIN network that we talked about last year, or I can't even remember what it's called with Mercy Culture, but we talked about a couple of different ones, and people were at churches and said, I didn't even know my church was a part of this network. And I didn't know that. I have a concern about it. And then it caused all sorts of issues because the church just didn't disclose it. So that's why we ask churches to disclose it, because one person may not have a problem with an affiliation and another person may, it's better to just let them know on the front end. So let me see. Then the congregation salvation is questionable for those who were saved, won't practice in sin and listen to them. Stop calling it church, just a TED talk. Um, I was just told about Acts 29. And I get it. It's easy to say that as well. You know, um, at the same time, a lot of people are baby Christians, and they don't know any better because they haven't been discipled. So I think there are times where it's like the man in First Corinthians 3 almost. It's like, yeah, I'm saved, got a relationship with Jesus, but I've just stayed a baby. It's what Paul talked about, never getting off the milk. And so I buy into this stuff. It's also we're taking a break this week from the Deconstructing the Church series, but that's why we're doing that, is because when people don't understand what church is, we we give our lives to something and call it church when often it's not. It is liberating, it is freeing, but it's also protective when we understand what the church is. Isa says, you just saved me from the church. Thank you, Lord. Talking about just finding out about Acts 29. And again, I want to be clear, just because the church is part of Acts 29 doesn't mean that's a bad church. I think it's worth asking questions, though, because just go back and look, do your research on your own at how many leadership issues they've had. I think it's been like 4 big ones. To me, there's something very concerning about that systemically. Chrissy says, I say you were good. You were here for a reason. I believe that. God puts us in the right places sometimes to be able to hear those things. So I'm glad that was helpful. But also, again, just to be crystal clear, I'm not blanket saying every church part of Acts 29 that you should leave it, but it's great questions to ask. And then you just got to trust what the Spirit is saying to you. Really do. Chrissy says people need to investigate their church and its leaders, especially if it's a new one. Yeah, I mean, if I'm in Scottsdale, Arizona, and I'm going to this big church, Trinity, and things are going well, and my pastor's all over social media, well, then I could probably look up and just see if any news reports hit that were negative. If I'm at Brian Tome's church and I just moved to Cincinnati and people are telling me about it, and I go to this big church and it's the 6th largest in the nation, well, let me just look something up, and then I find out about the Bible kicking and all that sort of stuff. That may not bother you. You may still go, but at least you're going in eyes wide open and going, well, yeah, that's kind of weird, right? A lot of us, we don't even ask those questions. I prefer, this doesn't mean it's right, it's just my preference. I prefer to go to a church where I actually have some knowledge of the pastor and some relationship with the pastor. And if I can't actually have lunch with the pastor, I don't know anything about them, I'm probably not going to that church or not staying at that church for very long. Because I want to go to a church where the people who are leading the organizational side are real people that I actually already know or can get to know. Chrissy said Bethel's excuse was lame. It was completely to control the narrative and silence people. Yeah, I mean, that's when I looked at it, I read their whole statement, and all I could think of was, it still sounds like you just didn't want people talking about things anymore, so you shut down the platform because you could. Wisdom would have told them, if they had just prayed for a little bit of wisdom would have told them that people were going to see that a different way. But I don't know that they prayed about it there. Isa says God is good, putting them here in the right place, right time. Chrissy says that the money is what the non-transparent are least transparent about. A lot of churches and Christians disagree with me about the money, and like Christians that are my friends, that I, people who I respect, like I respect, for instance, Ruslan. And when I had Ruslan on the podcast, we disagreed on our very first podcast. We don't agree about everything. But Ruslan is someone who I appreciate, and I appreciate being able to bounce things off of him. I appreciate his support, even when we disagree about things, and so we disagree on some of the financial things, right? But I think it's also one of those that we can have conversations, and it's always kind of eye-opening, because I've been taught by pastors that people get funny about money. I've been taught by pastors that if you really want to know where someone's heart is, look at their calendar and their checkbook and all that sort of stuff. So I say the same thing for churches. So I'm okay when people disagree with me about the full transparency issue. What I would say is, even if we disagree, where is your church transparent about finances? Because there should be some areas of finances where, even if they're not transparent the way I would ask, that they are transparent proactively. And I think that tells you a lot. If they're if they're opaque or they're translucent about everything financially, I think it's a pretty big problem. And then how do they answer those questions from church members, like people who are actually engaged? Are they willing to have those deeper conversations with them? Because in some churches, even for like when membership ask, they're not going to talk to them about anything. Like I know at the church I go to, they're not as transparent as I would be at this point about finances. But if you're a part of the church and you go ask, hey, let's sit down, let's have lunch. What can I show you? What do you need to know? And they're going to have those conversations even when they're uncomfortable. So Chrissy says a great example of why there needs to be nepotism policies is just look at what's going on with Second Baptist Houston, the Jeremiah Council, the Young Group. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff there. That's a lot to catch you up on. We've done some videos on it in the past, but if you there's a lot on the Rose Report, but you can just search Second Baptist Houston Jeremiah Council, and you're going to find a lot of stuff as well. So, anyway, guys, I appreciate y'all. I appreciate everybody who was able to stay all the way through the stream. Appreciate all the many of you who joined in and out of the stream. We'll get this stuff edited. We'll get it out as standalone videos for next week. I'll figure out what's going on the podcast, what's not. Hopefully next week, the plan is to be back to the primary segment of the live stream being deconstructing the church and talking about the roles in the church and church leadership. That's going to be a fun one, always challenging. But again, thanks for being here today. I hope this was helpful to help you think differently, because the bad news is we got a lot of sin, a lot of scandals. The good news is every single one of them is a learning opportunity if we're willing to learn. Sin leaves clues. So if we don't want to have our churches involved in sin, we just got to look at the clues. We got to look at the breadcrumbs. So we got to say, hey, let's get those things out of the church. And what can we do instead that would protect against those things? So anyway, again, I hope it's helped you to think differently, but I will see y'all next week. Praying for you. Look early next week, mid next week for some of these to come out standalone if you want to share them with somebody. But until then, grace and peace. I love you guys, and I'll see you next week.